Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. I didn't know anything had happened until my neighbor asked. It was late morning, maybe around 10:30, and I was out front dragging the trash bins back up the driveway. My neighbor Karen from across the street was walking her dog, a little white terrier that always stops to sniff the same mailbox every day. She slowed down when she saw me. "Did you see those lights last night?" she asked. I looked up from the bin. "What lights?" She seemed surprised. "Above your house." I laughed a little because I thought she meant someone's drone or maybe fireworks. "What time?" I asked. "After midnight, maybe around 1." I shook my head. I was asleep. Karen shifted the dog leash to her other hand. "They were strange," she said. "Bright but quiet. I thought maybe you had one of those big spotlights or something." "Definitely not," I said. She stared at the roof of my house for a second like she was replaying it in her head. "They came from that direction," she said, pointing down the street toward the small wooded area behind the houses. "Then they went right over your place." "How many lights?" "I'm not sure," she said slowly. 2 or 3 maybe, hard to tell. They were kind of blended together." "Like a plane?" She shook her head. No sound. The dog tugged on the leash and Karen let it pull her along a few steps. "Well, maybe you caught it on camera," she said. "You've got that doorbell thing, right?" "I do," I said. She smiled and kept walking. "Check it," she called back. "You might have slept through something interesting." I didn't think much of it at first. We get helicopters sometimes flying low over the neighborhood, especially during wildfire season. And there's a small regional airport about 20 miles away. But once I went back inside the house, curiosity got the better of me. I opened the doorbell camera app on my phone. The timeline showed a motion alert from 1:07 a.m. to Macan. That caught my attention right away. Usually those alerts are raccoons or stray cats wandering through the yard. I tapped the clip. The video started with the usual view of my front porch and driveway. The camera faces outward toward the street, with a slice of the roofline visible at the top of the frame. The street was empty. For the first few seconds, nothing happened. Then the whole screen brightened. Not like someone turned on a porch light, more like a soft glow spreading across the image. The driveway lit up first, then the front yard. The light grew brighter for about 2 seconds until everything looked washed out. I leaned closer to the phone. The glow was coming from above the camera's view. Something passing overhead. I watched the rest of the clip. The brightness moved slowly across the frame from right to left. The roofline at the top of the video cast a faint shadow as the light crossed over it. There was no flicker, no flashing, just a steady white glow sliding over the house. Then it dimmed. Within another second, the porch looked normal again. The whole clip lasted maybe 12 seconds. I replayed it, then again. The strange part wasn't just the light, it was the silence. The camera records audio along with video, so I turned the volume up. The night sounded completely normal. Distant crickets, a faint breeze, no engine noise, no helicopter blades, nothing. I watched the clip a few more times trying to figure out what could have caused it. A spotlight from a plane would move faster. A drone would make some kind of buzzing sound. This had neither. The light simply drifted across the frame. I scrubbed back to the beginning of the clip and froze it right before the glow started. The sky above the street was dark. Then I advanced 1 frame. A faint brightness appeared at the edge of the roofline. Frame by frame, the glow moved over the house. It wasn't circular like a spotlight beam, more like a wide patch of light, almost as if something large above the roof was reflecting light downward. I paused the video again, right in the middle of the clip. At peak brightness, the driveway looked almost like daytime, but the shadows were strange. The porch railing cast a long, soft shadow pointing toward the street, which meant the light source was directly overhead. I leaned back in my chair. That part made me uncomfortable for reasons I couldn't explain. Something had passed over the house, something bright enough to light the yard like that, and it hadn't made a sound. I checked the timeline again to see if there were any other alerts. There was one more. 1:08 a.m., just 1 minute after the first. I opened that clip. This one started with the porch already dim again. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then something else caught my eye. At the very top edge of the frame, above the roofline, there was a faint shape moving across the sky. Not a light, darker than the sky itself, almost like a shadow sliding over the stars. The camera didn't capture much of it, just the lower edge of whatever it was, but it moved slowly from left to right. Then it was gone. The clip ended. I sat there staring at the screen for a long time. The two videos together told a strange story. First, the bright glow, then something passing overhead afterward. I stepped outside onto the porch. The midday sun was bright and warm, nothing unusual about the street. Karen's house sat quiet across the road. Her terrier barked once from behind the fence. I looked up at the roof. From down on the porch, it looked completely normal. No marks, no damage. The sky above the neighborhood was empty. But later that night, when I checked the camera again before going to bed, I noticed something small I hadn't seen earlier. Right in the middle of the bright clip, just as the glow reached its peak, the camera's exposure struggled for a moment. And for one frame, just one, the image showed a faint outline above the roof. 3 dim points arranged in a triangle. I first noticed the clearing because the trees opened up too suddenly. I'd been hiking for about an hour along a narrow trail in the Cascades outside Leavenworth, Washington. It was late afternoon, maybe around 4:30, and the sky had that gray look that usually means fog is rolling in from the higher ridges. The air smelled damp and cool, and the ground was soft from rain earlier in the week. I was hiking alone, which wasn't unusual for me. My friend Eli had bailed on the trip the night before because he caught some stomach bug, but I'd already taken the day off work and packed my gear. The trail I was on was pretty quiet. I hadn't seen another person since leaving the small parking area near the river. The forest there is thick. Tall fir trees, moss-covered trunks, and ferns growing everywhere along the ground. Most of the time you can't see more than 20 yards in any direction. So when the trees suddenly thinned out, it stood out immediately. The trail curved slightly downhill and opened into a small clearing maybe 30 feet across. The grass in the clearing looked wrong. Not dead. Flattened. Like something heavy had pressed it down evenly in a circle. I slowed my pace and stepped off the trail. The circle was nearly perfect, maybe 20 feet wide. The grass inside it was bent in the same direction, lying almost flat against the ground. Around the edge of the circle, the grass stood normally. I walked around the outside of it first. The ground felt slightly softer under my boots inside the circle, like the soil had been pressed down recently. My first thought was that a helicopter might have landed there, but the clearing was too small and there were no broken branches around the edges. No tire tracks either, just the flattened grass. I pulled my phone out to take a picture. That's when I noticed the signal was gone. Not unusual for that area, so I didn't think much about it. I stepped into the circle. The grass crunched faintly under my boots, still damp. Standing in the middle, I turned slowly and looked around. The forest felt quieter there. Not silent, but the usual sounds seemed muffled. The breeze in the trees sounded distant somehow. I took a couple pictures of the ground. Then I opened the compass app out of habit. It spun immediately. At first, I thought it was just recalibrating. Sometimes the compass takes a second to settle when you open it, but the needle didn't stop. It rotated in slow circles, north, east, south, west, then around again. I tilted the phone slightly. The needle kept spinning. I frowned and stepped back toward the edge of the circle. The compass slowed. Then it stopped. The needle pointed north like it should. I looked back at the center of the clearing. Then I stepped into it again. The compass started spinning immediately. Not fast. Just a steady rotation, like it couldn't decide where north was. I turned slowly while holding the phone level. The needle didn't react to my movement. It just kept rotating. I lowered the phone and looked around the clearing again. The trees stood thick around the edges, their branches blocking most of the sky. The fog had moved in closer now, hanging low between the trunks. Something about the place made the hair on my arms stand up. Not fear exactly. Just a strange awareness that I didn't like standing there. I crouched down and brushed my hand over the flattened grass. It was cool and slightly damp. The blades were bent but not broken, almost like they'd been pressed down evenly instead of trampled. I stood back up and looked at the compass again. Still spinning. The movement wasn't random either. The needle made full rotations every few seconds, always in the same direction, clockwise. I took a few steps toward the edge of the clearing again. The needle slowed, then stopped. Perfectly still. I stepped back toward the center. The needle spun again. I repeated that a few times just to be sure. Same result every time. I stood there staring at the phone for a while. Eventually, I slipped it back into my pocket and walked around the circle again. The forest outside, it looked normal. Moss on the tree trunks, fallen branches, ferns everywhere. But inside the circle, the ground felt different, slightly warmer through the soles of my boots. Not hot, just noticeably warmer than the surrounding forest floor. I knelt down again and pressed my palm flat against the grass. The warmth was faint, but real. I sat there for maybe a minute before standing up again. The fog had thickened around the trees, making the clearing feel smaller. I checked my watch. It read 5:02. That confused me. I was pretty sure it had been closer to 4:30 when I stepped into the clearing, but I shrugged it off. Hiking time can get weird when you're not paying attention. I stepped back onto the trail. The forest sound seemed louder again almost immediately. Wind moving through the branches, distant water somewhere down the slope. I walked maybe 20 yards before stopping and turning around. The clearing was barely visible through the trees, just a pale patch of flattened grass in the fog. For a second, I considered going back and taking more pictures, but the feeling I'd had standing there made me hesitate. Instead, I kept walking. The trail eventually looped back toward the river and the parking lot. When I got back to the car, the first thing I did was check my phone again. The compass pointed north without any movement. The signal bars were back too. Before starting the engine, I opened the photo gallery to look at the pictures I'd taken in the clearing. There were only two. Both of them were blurry. Not motion blur exactly, just soft and out of focus, like the camera couldn't lock onto anything. In one of them, right near the center of the frame, there was a faint, darker patch in the grass, circular, almost like a shadow. I drove home after that. But later that night, when I checked the compass again, just out of curiosity, it spun slowly for a second before settling. The clicking started right after I turned onto County Road 12. I remember because I'd just passed the last gas station outside of town. The radio had been playing some late-night country station out of Duluth. It was around 11:30, maybe a little later. I was driving home from my cousin Nolan's place after helping him replace the brakes on his truck. County Road 12 runs through miles of forest and farmland before it connects back to the highway near my house. At that hour, it's usually empty. No streetlights, no houses for long stretches, just the road and the trees. The night was clear and cold, early November. The kind of cold where your breath fogs the windshield if the heater isn't running. I'd been driving maybe 5 minutes when the radio changed. It didn't fade out like when you lose signal. The music just stopped. Then the clicking started. At first I thought it was part of a song intro or something strange on the station, but it kept repeating in this steady rhythm. Click, pause, click, pause, click. The pattern wasn't perfectly even, but it repeated over and over. I reached over and adjusted the volume knob. The clicking got louder. No voices, no music, just that sound. I tried changing the station. Nothing happened. The display still showed the same frequency, but every station had the clicking now. I glanced out the windshield, then back at the radio. Great, I muttered. Radio's dying. The road ahead was straight and empty. My headlights lit up the gravel shoulder and the dark wall of trees on both sides. The clicking continued. Click, 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 pause. Something about the rhythm started to get under my skin. It wasn't random static, it almost sounded deliberate. I turned the radio off. The clicking kept going. For a second, I thought it was coming from somewhere else in the car. Maybe the dashboard or the speakers shorting out. But then I realized the radio screen was still glowing faintly, even though I'd shut it off. The clicking continued through the speakers. I frowned and reached to turn the power button again. Before I touched it, something caught my eye through the windshield. A light. It was moving slowly above the tree line on the right side of the road. At first, I assumed it was an airplane, but it wasn't blinking like one, and it was lower than I expected. Just a dim white glow drifting across the sky. I kept driving, watching it out of the corner of my eye. The clicking from the radio kept repeating in the same pattern. Click, pause, click, click. The light moved slowly over the trees, matching the direction I was driving. I rolled down the window halfway. Cold air rushed into the car. I listened for an engine or propeller noise. Nothing. Just the tires humming against the pavement and the steady clicking from the speakers. The light continued gliding above the forest. It wasn't bright enough to light the trees or the ground, just a soft glow moving behind the branches. I slowed the car slightly. The clicking changed. The rhythm sped up. Click, 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 click. I stared at the radio. The display flickered for a second. Then the clicking returned to the original pattern. Click, pause, click, click. When I looked back at the sky, the light had moved closer to the road. It was still above the trees, but now I could see it more clearly. It looked round, not huge, maybe the size of a distant street lamp from where I was, but it moved too smoothly. No wobble, no blinking lights, just drifting. I slowed the car again until I was doing maybe 30. The light kept pace. The clicking continued. My chest felt tight for no clear reason. I turned the radio volume all the way down. The clicking didn't get quieter. It stayed the same volume, like it wasn't connected to the knob anymore. I reached over and pulled the power cord from the cigarette lighter just to make sure the system wasn't shorting out. The radio screen went dark. The clicking continued. Now it sounded almost like it was echoing inside the car. Click. Pause. Click, click. I glanced up again. The light had moved directly above the trees across from the road. Then it stopped, just hung there. The clicking stopped at the same moment. The silence inside the car felt heavy. Even the tires seemed quieter on the road. I slowed to a crawl and leaned forward over the steering wheel, staring through the windshield. The light stayed still above the tree line. Then it moved, but not the way I expected. Instead of continuing across the sky, it dropped slightly behind the trees, disappearing for a second. My stomach tightened. Then it rose again on the other side of the road. Now it was above the trees on the left. Still silent, still glowing faintly. The clicking returned, faster this time. Click, 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 click. I gripped the steering wheel harder without realizing it. The light hovered there for maybe 5 seconds. Then it shot upward. Straight up. Not like a flare or a rocket. Faster. Within a second, it was high above the trees. Within 2 seconds, it looked like a star. Then it vanished. Just gone. The clicking stopped immediately. The radio screen flickered back on by itself. Music came rushing through the speakers like nothing had happened, some country song halfway through the chorus. I sat there for a second before realizing I was still rolling down the road. The trees looked normal again. The sky was full of stars, nothing moving. I drove the rest of the way home without turning the radio off. But when I pulled into my driveway and shut off the engine, I noticed something strange. The radio display stayed lit for another few seconds after the key was out, and right before it finally went dark, there was one last faint sound from the speakers. Click. Pause. Click, click. I was lying on the hood of my car, watching the sky, when I noticed the stars start moving. It was late August, and still warm even though it was past midnight. I'd driven out to an overlook above the Columbia River Gorge in Oregon. There's a gravel turnout near Rowena Crest where people stop during the day to take photos, but at night it's usually empty. My friend Leah had shown me the spot earlier that summer. She liked coming out there to watch meteor showers. That night she couldn't make it, so I went alone after work. The sky was clear, no moon, and the stars were sharp enough that you could pick out whole constellations without trying. I'd been there maybe 20 minutes, just leaning back on the hood of my Subaru with my hands behind my head. The engine was still warm under my shoulders. Every once in a while, a truck would pass far below on the highway, but up where I was, it was quiet. I'd been following a satellite for a bit. They're easy to spot if you stare long enough, just steady little dots moving slowly across the sky. When it faded out, I picked another star near the horizon to focus on. That's when I noticed it drifting. At first, I assumed it was another satellite. It moved the same way, Slow, steady, no blinking lights. But after a few seconds, I realized it was moving sideways relative to the stars around it, not across the sky like satellites usually do. I sat up a little. The point of light kept sliding slowly to the left. It wasn't fast. If I hadn't been staring right at it, I might not have noticed. I remember saying quietly, "Okay, weird." I watched it for maybe 15 seconds. Then it stopped. Not slowed down. Stopped. Perfectly still. I blinked a few times to make sure my eyes weren't playing tricks on me. Sometimes when you stare at the sky too long, everything starts drifting, but the surrounding stars were steady. Only that one had moved. Now it just hung there. I checked my phone out of habit to see if maybe it was a plane flying directly toward me, but there were no blinking lights, no sound, nothing. Just a small white dot. I leaned forward on the hood, elbows on my knees, staring up. The air smelled faintly like dry grass and dust from the hills. Somewhere down the slope, a coyote yipped once. Then it went quiet again. The light stayed frozen in place. 10 seconds. 20. Maybe 30. Then it moved again. This time it drifted upward slightly, like someone nudging it. My stomach did that slow, tightening thing you get when something doesn't add up. Satellites don't stop and change direction. I stood up off the car without taking my eyes off it. The gravel crunched under my shoes. The light hung there again for another few seconds. Then it shot off. Not fast like a shooting star. Faster. It went straight upward for maybe a second, then turned sharply to the right at an angle that didn't make sense, like it hit an invisible corner in the sky. Then it vanished. Just gone. I stood there staring at the empty space where it had been. The rest of the stars looked exactly the same. For a while, I just waited, expecting something else to happen. Nothing did. Eventually, I sat back down on the hood. I tried to convince myself it had been a satellite catching sunlight or something. Maybe my eyes had lost track of it and I'd picked up another star by mistake. But the movement had been too clear. I stayed another half hour after that. A couple normal satellites passed overhead. One airplane crossed the sky with blinking red and green lights. Everything looked normal again. I was just about to leave when something else happened. I noticed another point of light moving near the horizon over the river. This one was dimmer. At first, I thought it was a helicopter or something flying low, but there were no blinking lights and no sound coming up from the gorge. The light moved slowly along the line of the hills. Then it stopped. I felt that same tight feeling in my chest again. It hovered there for maybe 10 seconds. Then it dropped straight down behind the ridge like someone lowering it on a string. No arc. Just down. I walked to the edge of the overlook and leaned against the metal guardrail. The river below was barely visible in the darkness. Just a faint silver strip between the hills. Where the light had dropped, there was nothing now. No glow. No aircraft noise. Just darkness. I stayed there listening. The wind picked up slightly, brushing through the dry weeds along the roadside. That was when my car's radio turned on. I hadn't touched the keys. The engine was still off, but through the open driver's window I heard a burst of static. I turned slowly and walked back toward the car. The radio crackled again, then a few seconds of some distant talk station faded in and out. Then silence. I leaned in through the window and turned the knob. The radio was already off. I stood there for a moment, looking down the empty road that led back toward town. No headlights. No other cars. When I looked back up at the sky, another light had appeared roughly where the first one had stopped earlier. This one didn't move. It just sat there. At first, I thought it was probably a normal star I hadn't noticed before. But the longer I stared at it, the more it seemed slightly brighter than the others nearby. After maybe 20 seconds, it dimmed. Not suddenly, just slowly faded until it blended in with the surrounding stars. I realized I'd been holding my breath. I let it out and laughed quietly to myself, but it sounded forced. I got in the car and started the engine. The headlights washed over the gravel turnout and the guardrail. For a second I thought about staying longer, but the feeling of being alone up there suddenly felt heavier than it had earlier. I pulled back onto the road and started down the hill. As I rounded the first curve, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The overlook was already disappearing behind the slope. But above it, high in the sky, I saw one small point of light moving steadily upward. Not drifting. Not blinking, just climbing. It kept going until it became too small to see. The first thing I noticed was the time gap. I wasn't even looking for anything weird. I'd woken up early that morning and was drinking coffee in the kitchen when I opened the security camera app on my phone. I usually check it once before leaving for work just to make sure nothing strange happened overnight. The camera faces my backyard. I live in a small house outside Asheville, North Carolina, on a quiet road that backs up to a stretch of woods. It's not deep forest or anything, but it's thick enough that at night the yard gets pretty dark. The camera timeline showed a motion alert from 2:12 a.m., so that wasn't unusual. Sometimes deer wander through or raccoons trip the sensor. I tapped the clip expecting to see an animal. Instead, the video started with a flash. The whole screen turned white for a split second. Not like a camera glitch exactly, more like someone had set off a giant flashbulb right in the yard. Then the image came back. The weird part was the timestamp. Before the flash, it read 2:12:04. The next frame said 2:12:12, 8 seconds missing. I watched it again. Same thing. Flash. White frame. Then the time jump. At first I figured it was some kind of camera bug. The system's a cheap brand I bought online a couple years ago. It freezes sometimes when there's heavy rain, but the weather had been clear all night. I checked the forecast on my phone. No storms reported anywhere nearby. I replayed the clip again, this time watching the yard carefully. Before the flash, everything looked normal. The porch light was on, and the 2 solar path lights along the walkway were glowing like usual. Then the flash happened, and when the image came back, every light in the yard was off. Porch light, path lights, even the small string lights hanging along the fence, all dark. I frowned at the screen and scrubbed through the video again. The lights had been on right before the flash. I could see the glow clearly on the grass, then the white frame, then darkness. I walked over to the back door and looked outside. The porch light was on. So were the path lights. Everything looked normal. That made it stranger. I opened the app again and replayed the clip. Same result. I checked the camera settings, thinking maybe it had switched to night mode or something weird. Nothing had changed. The time gap still bothered me more than the flash. I zoomed in on the timestamp, 2:12:04. Then 2:12:12. No frames in between. The camera records 30 frames per second, so skipping 8 seconds meant hundreds of frames missing. I set my coffee down and went back through the camera history. There were no other alerts around that time, just the one at 2:12. I decided to check the front yard camera too. That one faces the driveway and the road. There was also a motion alert at 2:12 a.m. I opened it. Same flash. This one lit up the entire driveway like someone had taken a picture with a huge camera. The trees across the road were visible for a split second. Then the next frame showed darkness. The streetlight at the end of the road had gone out in the clip. My stomach tightened a little. I replayed it again. The timestamp jumped from 2:12:5 to 2:12:13. Another 8 seconds gone. The streetlight stayed dark for the rest of the clip. I walked to the front window and looked outside. The streetlight was on. Cars drove past it every so often, normal. I checked the rest of the night's footage. Nothing else looked unusual. No people in the yard, no animals, just that flash. I almost forgot about it by the time I left for work. But later that evening, something else happened. My neighbor Tom walked over while I was getting the mail. Tom's in his late 60s and always takes evening walks with his dog, a big old golden retriever named Rosie. He stopped near the mailbox and said, "Did your power flicker last night?" "Not that I noticed," I said. He scratched the back of his neck. "Mine did. Around 2 in the morning. Woke me up. I felt a small knot form in my stomach." "Power outage?" I asked. "No," he said. "Just everything went dark for a few seconds, then came back." "How many seconds?" Tom shrugged. "Hard to say. Maybe 5 or 6. I nodded slowly. "Why?" he asked. I hesitated before answering. "My cameras caught something around that time." "Like what?" I pulled out my phone and showed him the backyard clip. Tom watched the flash replay twice. "That's odd," he said quietly. "Look at the time," I said. He leaned closer. 8 seconds missing? "Yeah." He stared at the screen again. "Mar, could be lightning," he said after a moment. "Weather report says there wasn't any." Tom didn't reply right away. Rosie tugged on the leash and sniffed around my driveway. Finally, he said, "You ever see ball lightning?" "No." "Me neither," he said. We stood there a minute, then Tom nodded toward the woods behind my house. You hear anything strange last night? No. He looked at the trees for a moment, then shrugged. Probably nothing. He walked off down the road with Rosie. Mer. I went back inside, but couldn't shake the feeling that something about the clip still didn't make sense. So I opened the footage again. This time, I slowed it down frame by frame. The flash was brighter than I remembered. For one frame, the entire yard looked like it was lit by daylight. The grass, the fence, even the branches in the back looked sharp. Then the white frame. Then darkness. As I stepped through the frame slowly, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Right before the flash, there was a faint glow coming from the trees at the back of the yard. Not strong, just a pale light between the trunks. It lasted maybe 2 frames. Then the flash. Then the time jump. I leaned closer to the screen. The glow didn't look like headlights or a flashlight. It was higher up, maybe 20 feet above the ground. I scrubbed back and forth through those frames several times. The glow was definitely there. Then gone. I closed the app and walked out onto the back porch. The sun had already set, and the yard looked exactly the same as always. The path lights glowed softly along the walkway. The woods behind the fence were dark. I stood there for a while listening. Crickets chirped in the grass. A car passed somewhere down the road. Everything felt normal. Then the porch light flickered once. Just a quick blink. I looked up at it. The bulb steadied again. After a few seconds, I checked the time on my phone. 2:12 wasn't anywhere close. It was just after 9:30. I stayed on the porch another minute before going back inside. Later that night, before going to bed, I opened the camera app again. The timeline showed a new motion alert, 2:12 a.m., from the night before. A clip I hadn't seen yet. I tapped it. The screen stayed black for a moment. Then the first frame appeared. It showed the yard exactly 8 seconds after the flash. Everything dark. No lights, no movement. Just the empty yard. In the top corner, the timestamp read 2:12:12. But something else was different. The camera angle had shifted slightly, just enough that the top of the frame now showed more of the sky above the trees. And in that small strip of sky, there was a faint white blur. Not a star. Too large. Almost like something passing across the frame during the missing time. I woke up because the inside of my tent looked wrong. Not bright exactly, just dimly lit, like someone outside was holding a lamp far away. At first, I thought the sun was coming up early. I reached for my phone to check the time, and the screen said 2:17 a.m. That didn't make sense. The light outside wasn't strong enough to be sunrise anyway. It was soft and white, kind of like fog glowing. I stayed still in my sleeping bag for a minute, listening. Nothing. No wind in the trees, no insects, no distant cars. Just the quiet you get deep in the woods. I was camping in Mark Twain National Forest in southern Missouri. My friend Nate and I had hiked in about 3 miles earlier that afternoon and set up near a small creek. It was late September, cool but not cold. We had a fire going for a while, cooked some instant noodles, then turned in around 11. Nate's tent was about 20 feet away from mine. I lay there staring at the faint glow through the nylon of the tent wall. It wasn't moving. It wasn't sweeping around like a flashlight. It just sat there. I figured maybe Nate had gotten up and turned on his headlamp. But if it was him, the light should have been moving. This one wasn't. I sat up slowly. The light shifted slightly as the fabric of the tent wrinkled when I moved, but the source stayed steady outside. My first thought was someone else had wandered into our campsite. Sometimes hikers get turned around at night, so I called out quietly. Nate? No answer. I waited a second. Nate? Still nothing. That's when I realized something else felt off. The woods were completely silent. When we went to sleep earlier, there were crickets everywhere. A few owls in the distance too. Normal forest noise. Now there was nothing. I grabbed my phone again and turned the screen brightness down so it wouldn't light up the tent. Then I leaned toward the zipper. The glow outside made the zipper teeth look pale. For some reason I hesitated. It wasn't fear exactly. Just a weird feeling like opening the tent would break something, but curiosity won. I slowly pulled the zipper down about 6 inches. The light immediately disappeared. Not dimmed, just gone. Outside the tent was pitch black. I froze there, crouched halfway in my sleeping bag with the zipper open. My eyes adjusted after a few seconds. I could see the outline of trees and the faint gray of the trail beyond camp. But there was no light anymore. No flashlight. No lantern. Nothing. I unzipped the tent the rest of the way and leaned out. The air was cool and damp. The ground smelled like wet leaves. I stepped out barefoot and stood there. The forest looked normal, just dark. I glanced over at Nate's tent. It was zipped up tight. No way he slept through me calling, I muttered. I walked over and crouched beside it. Nate, I whispered. Nothing. I knocked lightly on the tent pole. He groaned immediately from inside. Dude, what? He mumbled. You got a light on out here? No, why? You didn't come outside. No, he said, sounding half asleep. What time is it? 2 something. He groaned again and rolled over. Go to sleep. I stood there for another few seconds, listening to him settle back down. Then I walked back to my tent. I looked around one more time before crawling back inside. The woods were still dead quiet. No insects. That stuck with me. I zipped the tent shut and laid down again, but I didn't turn my phone light on. I just lay there staring at the ceiling. Maybe 20 seconds later, the glow came back. It was fainter this time, but I could see the nylon walls slowly brighten again. My stomach tightened. The light wasn't moving around the campsite like someone walking. It was steady, and it felt closer now. I held my breath and listened. Still no forest noise. Then something else caught my attention. The creek. We had camped maybe 40 yards from a small creek running through a rocky channel. Earlier that evening, we could hear it clearly. Now I couldn't hear it at all. It was like someone had turned the volume down on the entire forest. I slowly sat up again. The glow outside had gotten a little brighter, enough that I could see the shadow of a branch on the tent wall. But the shadow wasn't moving in the wind, because there was no wind. I leaned toward the tent door again, but this time I didn't unzip it right away. I just stared at the light through the fabric, trying to figure out where it was coming from. That's when I noticed the shape. It wasn't a circle like a flashlight beam. It was wider, diffuse. Like the whole area outside the tent was glowing. My chest felt tight. I finally unzipped the door again, just a little. The moment the zipper opened, the glow vanished again. Instantly. The forest outside looked exactly the same as before. Dark trees, pale strip of trail, no light, no sound. I stepped out again, slower this time. The air felt strange, not colder, just still in a way that felt unnatural. I turned in a slow circle. Nothing. Then I looked up. The sky was completely clear. Stars everywhere, but there was one patch directly above the trees that looked darker than the rest. Not clouded, exactly. Just wrong somehow. Like a shape blocking the stars. I stared at it for a long time. The shape didn't move. Then after maybe 10 seconds, the stars slowly appeared there again, one by one, like whatever had been there had drifted away. I realized my hands were shaking. Behind me, Nate's tent zipper moved suddenly. He stuck his head out. "Why are you walking around?" he asked quietly. "You see that?" I said, pointing up. He looked at the sky for a few seconds. "See what?" "That spot," I said. "Just stars, man." I looked again. He was right. The sky looked normal now. Nate squinted at me. "You good?" "Yeah," I said after a second. "Thought I saw something." He shrugged and zipped his tent shut again. I stood there a little longer before going back inside mine. The glow didn't come back after that. The insects started up again maybe 10 minutes later, slowly at first, then normal. And eventually I could hear the creek again. I didn't sleep much the rest of the night. When morning came, everything looked exactly the same as when we set up camp. No footprints around the tents, no other campers nearby. But when I packed up my tent, I noticed the outside fabric on one side felt slightly warm. Not hot, just warmer than the rest, like it had been sitting in sunlight for a while. The weird part was that side had been facing the trees the whole night. I was driving home from my friend Derek's place a little after midnight. He lives out near Port Rowan, down these long farm roads where there's basically nothing but fields and the occasional barn light. I'd stayed later than I meant to because we got caught up watching old hockey clips and drinking cheap beer. By the time I left, the roads were empty. It was one of those clear, cold nights where the sky looks huge. No wind, just quiet. My car heater was running and the radio was low. I remember because the station kept fading in and out between songs. About 10 minutes into the drive, I noticed a white light in my rearview mirror. At first, I figured it was another car way back. The roads out there are straight for miles, so headlights can look like floating dots forever before they get close. But the light wasn't splitting into two beams like headlights usually do. It was just one dull white circle. Not bright, almost soft looking. I kept driving, and after another minute, I checked the mirror again. The light was still there. Same distance, same size. That's when I realized I hadn't seen any other traffic since leaving Derek's place. If it was a car, it must have turned onto the road behind me, somewhere I hadn't noticed. I shrugged it off and kept going. The weird thing started about 5 minutes later. I was doing around 55. It's a long, straight stretch of road with fields on both sides and no houses. When I glanced in the mirror again, the light hadn't changed at all. Not a little closer, not a little farther. Exactly the same. I remember thinking the driver must have had cruise control on and just happened to be matching my speed. But something about it bugged me. Even when two cars are going the same speed, the distance usually changes a little. You drift closer or farther without realizing. This thing didn't. I slowed down slightly, just eased off the gas. The speedometer dropped from 55 to maybe 48. The light stayed exactly where it was. Still the same size, still the same distance. That was the first moment I felt that small knot of unease in my stomach. I pressed the gas again and brought the car back up to speed. The light stayed there. I tried telling myself maybe it was farther away than it looked. Maybe it was some kind of tower light or something in the distance and I was just lining up with it as the road curved. But the road wasn't curving. It was straight. I checked the mirror again. Still there. Same dull white circle. Not bright enough to be high beams. Not flickering like aircraft lights either. Just steady. About 2 miles later, the radio started acting weird. The music faded into static, then came back for a few seconds, then cut out again. I twisted the knob trying to find a clearer station, but everything was just bursts of noise. I glanced up again. The light was still behind me, exactly the same distance. At that point, I started paying way too much attention to it. Every few seconds, I'd look up into the mirror. Still there, still following. But it never gained on me, never dropped back. It just matched me. The longer it stayed like that, the stranger it felt. I rolled my window down halfway and leaned slightly toward the mirror to see if I could hear another engine behind me. Nothing. Just the sound of my tires on the road. I drove like that for another few minutes before the road dipped into a shallow valley where trees lined both sides. The light disappeared behind the hill for a second. I actually felt relieved, but when I reached the bottom and started up the other side, it came back. Same spot in the mirror, like it had never gone away. That's when I said out loud, "Okay, that's weird." My voice sounded too loud in the car. The fields opened up again on both sides and the sky got wider. I glanced up through the windshield. Nothing ahead of me, just stars. I checked the mirror again, still there. By then, my brain had started running through explanations. Maybe it was a small plane flying low behind me, and the angle made it look like it was following the road. Maybe it was a drone or something, but if it was flying, it wasn't moving around like aircraft usually do. It just held position, perfectly. Another strange thing happened about then. My dashboard clock blinked. Just once. 12:41 to blank, then back to 12:41. I frowned at it for a second. When I looked back at the road, I realized I'd been gripping the steering wheel way too tightly. I forced myself to relax. Then I looked in the mirror again. Still there. I don't know why, but something about that made me decide to pull over. There's a gravel turnout along that road near a drainage ditch. I'd used it before to check my phone signal. I slowed down and turned into it. Gravel crunched under the tires as the car rolled to a stop. The second I stopped moving, the light in my mirror stayed there, just hanging in the sky. Now that I wasn't driving, I could tell it definitely wasn't headlights. It was higher up than the road, maybe 20 or 30 feet above it, a soft white glow. I turned off the engine. The silence was immediate. For a few seconds, nothing happened. The light just hung there behind me in the distance. Then it started fading. Not like it flew away, more like someone slowly turned down a dimmer switch. The circle got duller, smaller, fainter. I stepped out of the car and looked directly toward it. The air was cold enough that my breath showed. The fields were completely still, and the light kept fading. Within maybe 10 seconds, it was barely visible, just a faint blur against the stars. Then it was gone. Not streaking off, not moving, just gone. I stood there for a minute listening. No engines, no wind, nothing. I walked around the car and looked up and down the road behind me. Empty. I stayed there longer than I meant to, just staring at the sky, waiting for it to come back. It didn't. Eventually, I got back in the car and started driving again. The radio started working normally about a mile later. The rest of the drive home was quiet. No lights behind me, no other cars at all. When I pulled into my driveway, I noticed the dashboard clock said 1:18. I remember that because it confused me. The drive from Derek's place to my house usually takes about 25 minutes, maybe 30 if I go slow. But that night, it had been almost 45. I woke up at 3:03 a.m. because of the humming. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, but when I opened my eyes, the sound was still there. It wasn't loud, it was more like a vibration than a noise, something low that I could feel in my chest. The room was dark except for the faint orange glow from the streetlight outside my window. My phone was on the nightstand, screen lit up with the time, 3:03. The humming stayed steady, not like a car engine or a truck idling. It didn't rise or fall, it just held this low, constant tone. I lay there for a few seconds trying to figure out what it could be. My first thought was a generator or maybe someone's HVC unit outside. But my house sits at the end of a small road outside Flagstaff, Arizona. The nearest neighbor is about a quarter mile away, and at that hour, everything out there is usually dead quiet. The sound kept going. It was strange how I felt it more than heard it. My chest had this faint pressure, like when you're standing near heavy machinery, except there was no rattling or shaking, just that steady hum. I sat up in bed slowly. The moment I moved, I realized the air in the room felt slightly warmer than it should have been. Not hot, just warmer than the cool desert nights usually get. The humming continued. I swung my feet onto the floor and walked over to the window. The blinds were half closed, so I had to push them aside a little to look out. The yard was dark, just the gravel driveway, the old fence, and the line of juniper trees along the back of the property. Nothing moving. The humming stopped. It didn't fade out, it just ended. 1 second it was there, vibrating through my chest, and the next second it wasn't. The silence felt strange after that. I stood there for a few seconds staring outside, expecting maybe headlights to appear or something. Nothing did. The trees weren't moving, no wind, no animals in the yard. I opened the window slightly and leaned out. The desert air was cool and still. Somewhere far away, a dog barked once, then everything went quiet again. I waited a minute. No humming came back. Eventually, I closed the window and went back to bed. But I didn't fall asleep right away. I kept thinking about how the sound had felt more like pressure than noise, like it was inside the room somehow instead of coming from outside. After a while, I must have drifted off. The next thing I knew, my alarm was going off. The clock read 7:40. I sat up slowly, feeling a little groggy. That wasn't unusual. I'd been up late working the night before, but something else felt off. My bedroom window was open wider than I remembered leaving it. Not fully open, but enough that the curtain was moving slightly in the morning breeze. I was pretty sure I'd only cracked it a few inches. I got out of bed and walked over to it. The yard looked normal in daylight. The gravel driveway, the mailbox at the end of the road, the small shed near the fence. Nothing out of place. I closed the window and went to make coffee. While the coffee brewed, I checked my phone. No messages overnight. No missed calls. But when I opened the weather app, I noticed something odd. The temperature at 3 a.m. had been listed at 41 degrees. That was normal for early spring nights out there. But the indoor thermostat on the wall said the house had briefly reached 69 degrees at around the same time. I keep the heat set to 62 at night. I stared at the thermostat history for a minute. It showed a spike between 302 and 307. Then it dropped back to normal. I shrugged it off at first, assuming the system had cycled or something, but the humming came back into my mind. After breakfast, I went outside to check the yard. The gravel driveway looked the same as always, except for a patch near the fence where the stones looked slightly darker, like they'd been damp. I walked over and crouched down. The gravel wasn't wet exactly, just a little darker than the surrounding area, in a rough circle maybe 10 feet across. I pressed my hand against it. Warm. Not hot, but definitely warmer than the rest of the driveway. I sat there for a moment, running my hand through the stones. There were no tire tracks leading to it, no footprints either, just the circle. Later that afternoon, my neighbor Javier stopped by. He lives up the road in a small trailer and sometimes walks his dog past my place. We talked for a few minutes about normal stuff, then he asked something that made me pause. "You hear that weird noise last night?" he said. "What noise?" "Like a low buzzing," he said, making a humming sound. "Around 3, maybe." I looked at him. "You heard it too?" He nodded slowly. "Woke me up, thought maybe a helicopter flying low or something." "Did you see anything?" "No," he said. But my dog wouldn't stop whining. I didn't mention the circle in my driveway. Instead, I asked, "How long did the sound last?" Javier thought for a moment. "Maybe a minute," he said. Then it just stopped. That matched what I remembered. He shrugged and said it was probably some kind of aircraft from the nearby airbase. Maybe he was right. But that night, when I went to bed, I kept the window closed. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up again. No humming this time. Just silence. I lay there staring at the ceiling for a while before finally checking my phone. 3 a.m. I stayed awake for another 20 minutes waiting to hear the sound again. It never came. But when I stepped outside the next morning, the circle in the gravel had spread slightly wider. I was halfway down Maple Ridge Road when everything went quiet. My dog Baxter noticed it before I did. He stopped walking and stood stiff beside me, ears pointed up, staring toward the trees. It was just after midnight. Late spring, warm enough that I'd left my jacket at home. The air smelled like damp grass and honeysuckle from someone's yard down the street. I take Baxter out that late most nights. He's a 6-year-old lab mix with too much energy, and if I skip the walk, he paces the house for hours. Maple Ridge is a small suburban road outside Knoxville. Nothing fancy, just rows of houses and a stretch of woods at the end where the sidewalk stops. By midnight, the neighborhood is usually dead quiet except for insects. That night, the crickets had been loud the entire walk. Then they stopped, all at once, not faded out, just gone. I didn't notice right away because I was looking down at my phone checking a message from my sister. But Baxter had stopped moving completely, the leash pulled tight in my hand. "What is it?" I said. He didn't look at me, just kept staring up the road toward the dark patch where the woods begin. That was when I noticed the silence. No crickets, no frogs from the drainage ditch nearby. Even the distant hum from the highway sounded muffled. It felt like someone had turned down the volume on the whole neighborhood. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and looked around. The streetlights were still on, a few porch lights too. The houses looked normal, quiet, and dark. Baxter gave a low whine. "Relax," I said, tugging lightly on the leash. He didn't move. Then I noticed the sky. There were thin clouds drifting overhead, barely visible in the streetlight glow. And behind them, something faintly blue was moving. At first I thought it was moonlight catching the clouds in a weird way, but the moon wasn't out. The glow moved slowly across the cloud layer, like a pale blue stain sliding under the surface. It didn't look like lightning. There were no flashes or pulses, just a steady color. Baxter whined again and took a step backward. I looked around the street to see if anyone else was outside noticing it. No one. The glow drifted above the houses across the road, moving slowly from west to east. It was hard to judge the size because of the clouds, but it seemed wide. Wider than a house, maybe. I walked a few steps into the street to get a better view. The blue light moved with a smoothness that felt strange. Not like clouds moving with the wind, more like something passing behind them. I stood there watching it for a long time, though later I realized it was probably only 30 seconds. The silence around me made it feel longer. Even Baxter had stopped whining. He just stood pressed against my leg, staring up. As the glow moved overhead, the clouds above me brightened faintly, like a thin layer of fog catching light from below. I waited for a sound. Helicopter blades, maybe, or a distant engine. There was nothing, just the quiet. The glow kept sliding across the sky. At one point it paused, or maybe slowed. It hung above the trees at the end of the road for a few seconds. My stomach tightened for no clear reason. The blue light spread slightly across the clouds while it sat there. Not brighter, just wider. Then it began moving again, this time a little faster. Baxter pulled hard on the leash, trying to head back toward the house. "Easy," I said, but I didn't pull him back toward the woods either. I watched the glow until it reached the far side of the neighborhood, where the clouds thinned over the hills. Right before it disappeared, something else happened. The blue light shrank suddenly, like someone dimming a lamp. For a moment, it looked almost like a round shape behind the clouds. Then it was gone, just regular gray clouds drifting across the stars. For about 3 seconds, nothing changed. The silence stayed. Then the insects came back, not gradually, all at once. Crickets chirped from every yard. Frogs started up from the ditch again. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked twice. The normal night sounds slammed back in like someone flipping a switch. Baxter flinched. He immediately started walking back toward home without me even pulling the leash. I followed, glancing over my shoulder at the sky. Nothing unusual now, just clouds and a few stars. We made it halfway down the block when a porch light flicked on ahead of me. My neighbor Marlene stepped out onto her front steps wearing a robe. She squinted at the sky for a second before noticing me. "Did you see that?" she asked. I stopped on the sidewalk. "The blue thing?" She nodded slowly. "What was it?" she asked. "I have no idea." Marlene stared up at the clouds again, arms folded. "It got really quiet," she said after a moment. "Yeah." She looked down at Baxter. "He didn't like it either, huh?" Baxter tugged the leash again, clearly ready to go home. "No," I said. "He didn't." Marlene stayed on her porch, watching the sky while I walked Baxter the rest of the way back to my house. The crickets were loud again now, almost annoyingly so. When I reached my driveway, I looked up one last time. The clouds had thinned enough that more stars were visible. Everything looked normal. I went inside, gave Baxter some water, and sat down in the living room for a while before going to bed. About 10 minutes later, I realized something I hadn't noticed during the walk. The security light on the side of my garage hadn't turned on when we came up the driveway. It always does when something moves nearby. I opened the front door and waved my hand in front of the sensor. The light flicked on instantly, bright and normal. But for a moment while it warmed up, I could have sworn it had a faint blue tint. I first noticed the light when I came around a bend in the road and thought it was a star. It was late October, just after 9:30 at night, and I was driving home from a job site outside Ames, Iowa. I work maintenance for a grain processing company, so sometimes I'm out late fixing equipment or checking storage bins. That night, I'd been helping a guy named Kurt replace a busted auger motor. The road I was on cuts through miles of farmland, no streetlights, no houses for long stretches, just fields and the occasional barn light way off in the distance. The sky was clear and cold, the kind of night where the stars look sharp enough to touch. At first, the light didn't seem unusual. It was just a small pale point hovering over the fields ahead of me. I figured it was a star lined up with the horizon. But as I kept driving, something about it started to feel off. The road was straight for almost a mile, and the light didn't move relative to the ground. If it were a star, it should have looked higher in the sky. This one looked low, very low, maybe 10 or 15 feet above the field. I leaned forward slightly over the steering wheel, squinting through the windshield. The light stayed perfectly still. It wasn't bright like a floodlight or farm equipment beam, more like a dull white glow about the size of a golf ball from where I was. The cornfields had already been harvested, so the ground on both sides of the road was just flat dirt and stubble. The light hung above the middle of the field on my right. I slowed down a little. There weren't any other cars around, and the only sound inside the truck was the heater fan blowing warm air. As I got closer, the light stayed exactly where it was. No flickering, no movement, just hovering. I remember thinking it might be a drone. Some farmers use them now for checking irrigation or crop conditions. But drones usually have blinking lights. This one didn't. It also didn't make any noise. I rolled down the window as I approached. Cold air rushed into the cab, still no sound. I drove past the field slowly, keeping my eyes on the light through the passenger window. It hovered about 20 yards out from the edge of the road, suspended over the dirt. Now that I was closer, I could tell it wasn't shaped like a bulb or a beam. It was more like a small sphere of pale light, not glowing intensely, just present. I slowed the truck almost to a stop. The engine idled softly. The light didn't react at all. I glanced around the field for any equipment that might explain it. A pole, a machine, anything. Nothing. Just empty ground stretching to the tree line in the distance. I sat there for a moment watching it. My first thought was that maybe someone had set up a weather balloon or some kind of marker light. But it wasn't attached to anything. It hovered, completely steady. The longer I looked at it, the stranger it felt. There was no beam coming down from it, no shadows on the ground, just the small glowing point. I turned off the truck's headlights. The road went dark except for the faint glow from the dashboard and the pale light hovering in the field. The stars overhead looked normal. The light in the field stayed the same. I stepped out of the truck. The cold air hit me immediately, carrying that dry, earthy smell you get from harvested fields. I shut the door quietly and leaned against the side of the truck. The light hovered maybe 20 feet away, still perfectly still. I expected it to move or flicker now that I was outside. It didn't. I took a few steps toward the ditch beside the road. The gravel crunched under my boots. The light remained in place. At that distance, it looked about the size of a softball, maybe a little bigger. But the edges weren't sharp, more like a soft blur. I stood there staring at it. The whole situation felt oddly calm. No wind, no insects, no distant engines, just me and that pale light sitting above the field. Then something changed. The light brightened slightly. Not a flash, just a gradual increase, like someone slowly turning up a dimmer. At the same time it rose. Only a few feet at first. I froze. The light lifted higher off the ground, smooth and steady. Still no sound. It reached maybe 20 feet up and paused. I felt my chest tighten without really knowing why. The light stayed there for maybe 3 seconds. Then it moved again, this time faster. It drifted straight upward, passing above the height of the nearby trees. Within a couple seconds, it was high enough that I had to tilt my head back to follow it. Still silent, still glowing the same dull white. It climbed higher and higher until it looked just like a normal star again. Then it changed direction. Instead of continuing upward, it slid sideways across the sky. Not fast like a shooting star, but faster than anything I'd seen move like that before. It crossed maybe half the sky in 3 or 4 seconds. Then it faded, not vanished instantly, just dimmed until it blended into the other stars. I stood there in the road for a long time after that. The night felt normal again. A faint breeze moved across the field, rustling the dry corn stalk leftovers. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once. Eventually, I turned the truck headlights back on and climbed inside. The heater was still running, warm air filling the cab. I drove the rest of the way home without seeing anything else unusual. But when I passed the same stretch of road the next morning on my way back to work, I slowed down and looked into that field again. The spot where the light had been hovering looked slightly different from the rest of the dirt. Just a small circle where the soil looked darker, like it had been damp overnight. There hadn't been any rain, and I noticed the glow before I noticed the silence. It was close to midnight, and I was standing at the edge of Lake Martin in Alabama, casting into the dark water. I'd been out there for a couple hours already. The air was warm, thick with that humid summer smell you get near the lake, wet wood, algae, and the faint smoke from someone's distant fire pit. Night fishing is something I do a lot. Fewer boats, fewer people. Usually just the sound of insects and water moving against the rocks. That night, the lake had been loud earlier. Frogs calling, crickets everywhere, the usual stuff. But at some point, I realized I couldn't hear any of it. At first, I thought I just stopped paying attention. I'd been focused on the bobber drifting out on the surface, maybe 30 feet from the dock. Then I looked up. The shoreline across the water was dark, except for one cabin light far off in the trees. The water was smooth, barely rippling, and it was quiet. Not completely silent, but wrong. The frogs had stopped. Even the insects had faded down to almost nothing. I reeled in slowly and cast again. The line whistled softly through the guides, and the bobber plopped into the water. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then I saw the glow. At first, I thought it was a reflection of that distant cabin light. But the angle didn't make sense. The glow was under the surface, not on top of it. It was faint, kind of bluish white, and it moved slowly beneath the water about 20 feet out. I leaned forward, squinting. The glow drifted along in a straight line just under the surface. It wasn't bright enough to light the water around it much, just a small, soft patch moving through the dark. My first thought was someone underwater with a flashlight, maybe a diver, but there were no bubbles and no sound of a boat anywhere nearby. I stood there watching it for a few seconds. The glow kept moving, steady and smooth, cutting across the lake like it was following an invisible path. Too straight for a fish, too controlled for something random. I lifted the rod slightly so the line wouldn't drag through it. The glow passed under the spot where my bobber floated. For a moment, the bobber lit up faintly from below. Then the glow kept going. I stepped to the edge of the dock. The wood creaked under my weight. The glow didn't react at all. It just continued gliding through the water at the same speed. I remember thinking maybe it was some kind of bioluminescent algae patch moving with a current. But the lake wasn't flowing like that. And it was too concentrated, like a single point. The glow traveled another 20 feet and then stopped, completely still. It hovered under the surface maybe 3 feet down. I stared at it for a long moment. The quiet around the lake suddenly felt heavier. I realized I couldn't hear anything except my own breathing and the faint creak of the dock boards. Even the distant cabin light across the water seemed dimmer somehow. The glow stayed there. Then it moved again. This time, it changed direction. Not gradually, like something turning in the water. It just shifted 90 degrees and continued straight. My stomach tightened a little. I glanced behind me at the dark tree line along the shore. Still no sounds. When I looked back at the lake, the glow had picked up speed. Not fast, just faster than before. It moved directly toward the dock now. My bobber twitched slightly as the line shifted in the water. The glow slid beneath it again, illuminating the underside of the float for a second. Then it kept coming. I felt a strange urge to step back. Instead, I stayed where I was. The glow reached the edge of the dock and stopped again. Now it was only a few feet from the surface, close enough that I could see the water above it shimmering faintly. I leaned down, gripping the railing. The glow pulsed once. Not brighter exactly, just a subtle shift. Then it rose, slowly. The light moved straight upward through the water until it reached the surface. For a split second, it looked like a pale disc just under the lake's skin. Then it broke through. There was no splash, no ripple. The light lifted cleanly out of the water like it had never been touching it. I froze. The glow hovered about 2 feet above the lake, small, maybe the size of a basketball, soft white with a faint blue tint. Still completely silent. I waited for the sound of a drone or something mechanical. Nothing came. The light hung there for maybe 3 seconds. Then it shot upward, not like a firework or a flare, faster. 1 second it was hovering over the water, the next it streaked straight up into the sky. Within maybe 2 seconds it was gone. No fading, just vanished against the stars. For a moment, everything stayed quiet. Then the lake sounds came back. Frogs started calling again from the reeds. Crickets filled the air. The water lapped softly against the dock like it had before. I stood there for a long time, holding the fishing rod without moving. Eventually, I reeled in the line. The bobber was still there, drifting normally. I packed up my tackle box and walked back up the path to the truck. Halfway up the hill, I turned around and looked at the lake again. The water was dark and calm. Nothing glowing beneath the surface anymore. But right where the light had come out of the water, there was a faint ring spreading slowly across the lake. The power went out around 10:40 that night. I remember the exact time because I just checked the oven clock while waiting for water to boil. The kitchen lights blinked once, and then everything shut off at the same time. The refrigerator hummed down, the microwave display vanished, and the house went quiet. Blackouts happen occasionally where I live. I'm in a small town outside Billings, Montana, and when storms roll through, the grid can drop for a few minutes. But there wasn't a storm that night. It had been a warm, dry evening. The sky was clear and the windows were open because the air felt good after sunset. For a moment, I just stood there in the dark kitchen listening. No wind, no thunder, just the quiet. Then I noticed something else. The street outside was dark too. Usually when my house loses power, the streetlights down the block stay on because they're on a different line. But when I looked through the window, the whole neighborhood looked black. I grabbed my phone off the counter and turned on the flashlight. The small beam bounced around the kitchen walls while I walked to the front door. When I opened it, the night outside felt unusually still. A couple houses down, I saw my neighbor Kyle standing on his porch holding his phone up like I was. "Your power out?" he called across the yards. "Yeah," I said. "Whole block's down." He waved his phone toward the street. I stepped out onto the driveway and looked around. He was right. No porch lights, no street lights. Even the gas station sign at the corner of the highway was dark. The only light came from the stars. Without the usual street glow, the sky looked huge. I could see a thick band of stars running across the horizon. Kyle stepped off his porch and walked halfway across his yard. "Probably a transformer somewhere," he said. "Maybe." We stood there for a minute, both looking down the road. Then Kyle's dog started barking inside his house, and he went back toward the door. "Hope it comes back soon," he said. "Yeah." He went inside, leaving me alone on the driveway. I stayed there a while because the night felt strangely calm without all the usual electric noise. No hum from houses, no buzzing from streetlights, just the sound of distant crickets. After a minute, I looked up at the sky. That's when I noticed the shape. At first, I thought it was just my eyes adjusting to the dark. But as I stared longer, I could see something moving slowly across the stars. It wasn't a light. It was darker than the sky. A triangle. Not a perfect outline like something drawn with lines, but three faint edges blocking out the stars behind them. I blinked a few times to make sure I wasn't imagining it. The shape kept drifting. Slow. Silent. If I hadn't been staring directly at it, I probably wouldn't have noticed at all. The only reason I could see it was because the stars disappeared where the triangle passed. I stepped farther into the driveway for a better view. The thing was enormous. It stretched across a big section of sky, easily wider than my house from that distance. But there were no lights on it. No blinking beacons like aircraft. Just the dark shape moving across the stars. My first thought was that it had to be clouds, but there weren't any other clouds in the sky, and it was too solid looking. I watched it drift slowly overhead, still no sound, not even a distant engine. Planes fly over my town pretty often, and even when they're high up, you can usually hear them faintly. This made nothing. The triangle continued sliding across the sky, steady and smooth. It reminded me of watching a shadow pass over water. I tried to judge how high it was, but that was impossible. It could have been miles up or closer. Without lights or sound, there was nothing to measure it against. I stood there staring for what felt like a long time. Eventually, the front edge of the triangle reached the far side of the sky above the fields behind my house. The stars reappeared where it had been. Then the rest of the shape followed. Within maybe 30 seconds, it was gone. The sky looked normal again. Just stars. I stayed there another minute, waiting to see if it would come back. It didn't. Right then, the power returned. The porch light behind me snapped on suddenly, and the streetlights down the block flickered to life. The sudden brightness made me squint. I turned around and looked back at the sky. The stars were harder to see now, with the streetlights glowing again. The sky looked empty. Kyle stepped back out onto his porch. "Hey, power's back," he said. "Yeah." "You see anything weird out here?" he asked casually. I hesitated for a second. "Like what?" he shrugged. "Thought I saw something moving earlier, probably just birds." I looked up again. The sky was completely clear. "No," I said after a moment. "Didn't see anything." Kyle nodded and went back inside. I stayed on the driveway another minute before going in myself. Later that night, I walked out again before bed just to check the sky one more time. The stars were still there, but the shape never came back. What stuck with me most was the silence. For something that big, moving that slowly across the sky, there should have been some kind of sound. But there hadn't been anything at all. I noticed the video because my phone battery was lower than it should have been. When I woke up that morning, it was sitting on the nightstand where I always leave it, screen facing down. I'd plugged it in before bed like usual, but the battery was at 64% instead of full. At first, I assumed the charger had come loose. The cable in my apartment is old and sometimes slips out if the phone shifts during the night. But when I picked the phone up, it was still plugged in. The screen lit up, and the first thing I saw was the camera app notification. Video saved. Timestamp, 2:41 a.m. I frowned at it for a second. I live alone in a small apartment outside Boise, Idaho. My phone had been sitting on the bedside table all night, untouched. I definitely hadn't recorded anything at 2 in the morning. Curious, I opened the camera roll. There it was, a 17-second clip. I hit play. The screen was almost completely black. The camera had been pointing slightly upward, probably toward the ceiling and the window above the bed. For the first few seconds, nothing moved. Then a faint light appeared near the window. It wasn't bright, just a soft glow, barely visible in the darkness. It pulsed slowly, like a dim heartbeat. The rest of the room stayed black. I watched the whole clip twice. 17 seconds of darkness and that faint pulsing light near the window. Then the video ended. I sat there on the edge of the bed trying to figure out how the phone could have recorded it. The camera app doesn't open itself. You have to press the button or swipe the screen. My phone had been face down. Even if it somehow activated in my sleep, the video angle didn't make sense. The camera was aimed slightly toward the window, not straight up like it would be if it had been sitting flat. I stood up and looked at the bedside table. The phone usually sits right in the center, but now it was closer to the edge, angled slightly toward the window. I picked it up again and replayed the video. The light pulsed 3 times during the clip. Slow, steady brightening and dimming. Not flashing, more like breathing. The window itself wasn't visible clearly, just the faint outline of the blinds. I got out of bed and walked over there. It was a normal morning. Pale sunlight coming through the blinds, the parking lot outside already starting to fill with cars. Nothing strange. I checked the window latch, locked. Then I looked at the floor beneath it. Nothing out of place, just the small rug and the wall outlet where my fan usually plugs in. I went back to the bed and watched the video again. This time I noticed something else. During the second pulse of light, the edge of the blinds moved slightly. Not much, just a small shift, like something outside had passed close to the window. But the blinds weren't open. I paused the video and zoomed in. The glow looked like it was coming from outside the glass. I checked the weather app. Clear skies overnight, no storms, no lightning. I stood there thinking about it for a while before getting ready for work. The rest of the day I kept replaying the clip in my head. By the time I got home that evening, I decided to check something. My apartment building has a narrow walkway outside the windows on that side. Not really a balcony, just a strip of concrete for maintenance workers. I slid the window open and leaned out. The air smelled like asphalt and dry grass from the lot. The walkway ran along the building about 2 feet wide. I stepped carefully onto it and looked down. Nothing unusual. No marks, no equipment, nothing that might have caused a light. When I stepped back inside, I noticed something small on the window frame. A thin smear on the glass. Not dirt exactly, more like condensation that had dried unevenly. I rubbed it with my thumb. The glass felt slightly warmer than the rest of the window. That was strange because the evening air outside was cool. I wiped the smear away and closed the window. Later that night, I sat on the bed with the phone in my hand watching the video again. The pulsing light looked even stranger the more I stared at it. The rhythm wasn't perfectly even. The first pulse lasted about 2 seconds. The second, a little longer. The third, shorter. Like something adjusting itself. At one point during the clip, I noticed the camera shifted slightly. Not a big movement, just a tiny tilt. The kind you'd get if someone picked up the phone or nudged the table. But I'd been asleep the whole time. At least I thought I had been. I checked the phone's motion logs. There was a tiny spike at 2:41 a.m., right when the video started. I sat there staring at the screen for a long time. Eventually, I set the phone back on the nightstand and turned off the lamp. The room went dark except for the faint glow of the street light outside. For a while, I just lay there listening to the quiet hum of the building. After maybe 10 minutes, I glanced toward the window. The blinds were closed like always. But for a moment, I thought I saw a faint glow on the other side. I held my breath and waited. Nothing happened. The glow didn't come back. I eventually fell asleep. The next morning, the phone battery was down to 71%. And there was another video in the camera roll. This one was 18 seconds long. I first noticed the light because the frogs stopped. I was sitting on the back porch with a glass of iced tea, just letting the night cool off after a long day. It was late July, humid and still, one of those evenings where the air feels thick even after the sun goes down. My place sits just outside a small town in southern Ohio, and the property backs up to a stretch of woods that runs along a shallow creek. Most nights, the sound from that creek carries all the way to the house. Frogs, insects, the occasional rustle of something moving through the brush. It's usually loud enough that you don't think about it. But that night, it all stopped. I didn't notice right away. I'd been looking down at my phone, answering a message from my sister. Then I realized the background noise had faded out until the porch felt strangely quiet. I looked up. The yard was dim except for the yellow porch light behind me. Beyond the fence, the tree line formed a dark wall against the sky. That was when I saw the light. It was hovering just above the tops of the trees about half a mile away, maybe a little more. At first, I assumed it was an airplane approaching from the distance. But it wasn't blinking, just a steady white glow, small but clear against the darker sky. I leaned forward in the chair and squinted. The light stayed perfectly still. Airplanes move. Even if they're coming straight toward you, you can usually see them getting brighter or shifting position. This one didn't change at all. I set my phone down on the armrest and kept watching. The sky above the trees was clear enough to see a few faint stars, but this light was brighter than any of them. Not blinding, just solid and steady. For a moment I thought maybe it was a tower beacon on the far ridge, but there aren't any towers out there. I've lived in that house for 8 years. I know that stretch of woods pretty well. The frogs still hadn't started up again. Even the crickets sounded quieter than before. I checked the time on my phone, 10:58 p.m. When I looked back at the tree line, the light was still there. Same brightness, same position, not flickering. I stood up from the porch chair and walked to the railing. The wood creaked under my weight. The light didn't react. I leaned my elbows on the railing and stared at it. After maybe 20 seconds, I noticed something else. It didn't look like a point of light anymore, more like a small disc, slightly blurred around the edges. I rubbed my eyes and looked again. Still there, hovering just above the treetops, completely still. The longer I watched it, the stranger it felt. There was no sound coming from that direction. No engine noise, no helicopter blades, just the quiet. I glanced over my shoulder toward the road out front, half expecting to see someone else outside looking at the sky. But the houses down the road were dark. When I turned back, the light hadn't moved. At that point, I'd probably been watching it close to a minute. Then it shifted. Not forward or backward. Sideways. The movement was smooth, almost like it slid across the sky rather than flying. Just a slow, steady glide to the left. My first thought was that maybe it was finally revealing itself as a plane changing direction. But the speed was wrong. Too smooth, too controlled. The light traveled sideways above the tree line for maybe 5 seconds. Then it stopped again, right in the middle of the sky above the woods. The frogs were still quiet. I could feel a strange tension building in my chest, though I couldn't say exactly why. Nothing dramatic was happening, just a light hovering over the trees. Then it moved again, this time faster. It slid sharply to the left, covering a much wider distance in just a second or two. Then it disappeared. Not faded out, just gone. One moment it was there, the next it wasn't. The sky above the trees looked empty. I stood there staring at the spot where it had been. About 3 seconds later, the frogs started again. The sound came back all at once, loud enough that it almost startled me. Crickets followed, filling the air with that steady summer noise like nothing had interrupted them. I stayed on the porch for a while after that, watching the tree line. Nothing else appeared. Eventually, I sat back down in the chair and picked up my phone again. I considered recording the sky if the light came back, but it didn't. About 10 minutes later, I noticed something else. The porch light behind me flickered once. Just a quick blink. I turned and looked at the bulb. It steadied again immediately. When I looked back at the woods, everything was normal. The frogs were still calling from the creek. The sky was clear, and the spot where the light had been looked exactly like the rest of the night sky. I noticed the smell before I noticed the window. It woke me up around 4 in the morning, though I didn't know the exact time until later. At first, I thought something electrical had shorted in the apartment. The air had that sharp metallic smell, kind of like when lightning strikes nearby or when a power outlet burns out. I lay there half awake, trying to figure out where it was coming from. My bedroom was still dark. The only light came from the street lamp outside, filtering through the blinds. The room felt cooler than it had when I went to bed. That was when I realized there was a faint breeze. It moved across my face, cold and steady. I sat up in bed. The window above the dresser was open. Not wide open, just cracked a few inches. But I always kept it locked at night. I'm pretty particular about that because my apartment is on the first floor. For a second, I just stared at it. The blinds shifted slightly in the breeze, tapping softly against the glass. I got out of bed and walked over to the window. The lock was turned sideways, unlocked. I ran my fingers along the frame. The metal felt cool. Outside, the parking lot was empty except for a few cars belonging to the neighbors in the building. The street lamp cast a pale circle of light on the pavement. Nothing looked out of place. I leaned closer to the opening and sniffed the air. The ozone smell was stronger near the window. Not overwhelming, but definitely there. I checked the screen. Still in place, no tears or loose edges. The whole thing made my stomach feel slightly uneasy, though I couldn't say why. There were plenty of normal explanations. Maybe I hadn't locked the window after all. Maybe a gust of wind pushed it open during the night. But I was pretty sure I had locked it. I always checked. I closed the window and turned the latch until it clicked. Then I stood there listening. The apartment was quiet. I could hear the refrigerator humming faintly in the kitchen and a distant car passing on the road outside. I looked at the clock on my phone. 4:07 a.m. I considered going back to bed, but the smell was still hanging faintly in the air. So I walked through the apartment checking things. The kitchen looked normal. No burned outlets, no lights left on. The breaker panel by the door hadn't tripped. I even opened the hallway closet where the water heater sits. Nothing. When I came back into the bedroom, the air still had that faint electrical smell. I sat down on the edge of the bed and stared at the window again. Something about the way the blinds moved in the breeze earlier stuck in my mind. It hadn't felt like a strong wind, just a steady flow of air, like the window had been open longer than a few minutes. Eventually, I lay back down and pulled the blanket up. I didn't fall asleep right away. My mind kept circling back to the lock. I was almost certain I had turned it before going to bed. At some point, I must have drifted off. The next time I woke up, it was daylight. The room looked completely normal. The smell had faded. For a few seconds, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. But when I sat up and looked at the window, something caught my eye on the dresser below it. A thin line of dust had been disturbed. My dresser collects dust pretty quickly because the window sits right above it. Usually there's a light gray layer along the surface. Now there was a narrow gap through the dust, like something had been placed there and then removed. I ran my finger across the surface. The dust smeared easily. The gap was about the size of my phone, but my phone had been charging on the nightstand all night. I checked it again just to be sure. Still there. I walked back to the window. The latch was still locked from when I'd closed it earlier. The screen hadn't been touched. Outside, the parking lot looked the same as always. I told myself I was overthinking it. Probably just moved something on the dresser the day before and forgot. But that explanation didn't sit right. That afternoon, I mentioned it to my neighbor Aaron while we were both checking the mailboxes in the hallway. Aaron lives in the unit next to mine and works nights as a paramedic. "You smell anything weird last night?" I asked. He frowned slightly. "Like what?" "Kind of electrical," I said. "Like ozone." He thought about it for a moment. "Actually, yeah," he said. "When I got home around 3. "You smelled it too?" "Out in the parking lot," he said. "Thought maybe a transformer blew somewhere." "Did the power flicker or anything?" "No." We stood there for a second. "Storm coming, maybe," he added. "Maybe." Later that evening, I checked the window again before going to bed. Still locked. I pulled the blinds down tighter than usual. Then I turned off the light and lay down. For a while, everything was quiet. The apartment felt normal again. But sometime during the night, I woke up briefly. Not fully awake, just that half-asleep moment when your mind notices something before your eyes open. There was a faint light in the room, soft, bluish. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the window. Before I could sit up or focus on it, the light faded. I fell back asleep almost immediately. In the morning, the window was still locked, but the ozone smell had come back, faint but unmistakable, lingering in the air near the blinds. I noticed the stars disappear before I noticed the shape. It was just after 11 p.m., and I was sitting in a lawn chair in the backyard behind my house. Early September, still warm enough to sit outside with the windows open. My place is on the edge of a small town in western Nebraska, where the houses thin out and you start seeing more fields than streetlights. The sky out there gets pretty dark once you're a few blocks from the main road. I had stepped outside mostly to cool off. The house had held on to the day's heat, and the air outside felt better. I brought a chair out, leaned it back, and started looking at the stars the way people do when they're half bored and half trying to relax. The sky was clear enough to see the Milky Way faintly stretched across the horizon. For a while, nothing happened. Just the usual things. An occasional plane blinking red and white far above, a few satellites sliding slowly from one side of the sky to the other. I'd been out there maybe 20 minutes when something caught my eye. A small patch of stars near the center of the sky vanished. Not all at once, one by one. I squinted, thinking maybe a thin cloud was drifting across them. But the rest of the sky was clear, and the missing stars weren't blurred the way clouds usually make them look. They were just gone. Then I saw the edge of it, a darker patch against the sky. It took a second for my eyes to adjust, but once they did, I realized I was looking at something moving. A shape. At first it looked almost triangular, but the edges weren't perfectly sharp. More like a big, dark wedge sliding across the star field. The only reason I could see it at all was because the stars disappeared behind it. I leaned forward in the chair. The shape kept moving. Slow. Much slower than the satellites I'd watched earlier. And it was big. Much bigger than any bird. I've seen plenty of birds flying at night out there. Geese sometimes pass overhead when they migrate. But this was something else. The shape covered a wide section of sky, maybe the size of a small cloud, but solid looking. I stood up from the chair without realizing I was doing it. The grass felt cool under my feet as I stepped away from the porch light so my eyes could adjust better. The shape continued drifting across the sky, completely silent. That part stuck with me immediately. Even at night, you can usually hear something if it's flying low enough. Wings, engines, something. This made nothing. I tried to estimate how high it was. That was impossible. If it was close, it had to be enormous. If it was far away, it still had to be huge to block that many stars. The more I watched it, the more I realized something else. It wasn't moving in a straight line like the satellites had earlier. It drifted slightly to the left as it crossed the sky. Not sharply, just a gradual slide, almost like it was adjusting its path. My chest felt tight without any clear reason. The shape kept gliding across the stars. Every few seconds, another cluster would vanish behind it, then reappear as the back edge passed. At one point, I thought I saw a faint point of light along the underside. Not blinking, just a dim white dot, but it disappeared so quickly, I couldn't tell if it had been real or just my eyes playing tricks. The object continued its slow movement. I checked the horizon behind me for planes or helicopters that might explain it. Nothing. The town was quiet. Most houses had already gone dark for the night. When I looked back up, the shape had reached the center of the sky. For a moment it seemed to pause, not completely stop, but slow enough that I noticed. The stars behind it stayed blocked for a few seconds longer than before. Then it started moving again, this time a little faster. Still smooth, still silent. I realized I'd been holding my breath. The shape slid toward the northern part of the sky. Eventually, the edge reached a darker patch where fewer stars were visible near the horizon. As it passed into that area, the outline became harder to see. The stars stopped disappearing. For a moment I thought it had vanished completely. Then, I caught the faintest hint of movement one last time. A darker section of sky sliding into the darkness beyond the fields. Then it was gone. I stood there, staring upward long after it disappeared. The sky looked normal again, stars everywhere. Nothing moving except a faint satellite drifting along the edge of the horizon. Eventually, I sat back down in the chair. The quiet around the yard felt different now, like I'd just watched something I wasn't supposed to notice. I stayed outside another 15 minutes, hoping it might come back. It didn't. But right before I went back inside, I noticed something odd. The porch light behind me flickered once. Just a quick blink. And for that brief second of darkness, the sky above the house looked completely empty of stars. I noticed the light before I fully woke up. At first, it felt like morning was coming early. My bedroom ceiling had that faint gray brightness you get right before sunrise when the sky starts lighting up outside. But something about it felt wrong. I opened my eyes and lay there for a moment, staring up. The ceiling was glowing, not brightly. Just a soft, pale white light spreading across the plaster like someone had turned on a lamp in the next room. My bedroom window sits on the opposite wall from the bed, and the blinds were closed. Normally, when street light leaks through them, it casts thin stripes across the ceiling. This was different. The whole ceiling was evenly lit. I pushed myself up slightly on the pillow and glanced at the clock on the nightstand. 2:16 a.m. The light held steady for maybe another second. Then it faded. Not instantly, just dimmed until the ceiling returned to the usual darkness. I lay there listening. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Outside, I could hear crickets somewhere beyond the yard. Nothing unusual. I told myself it was probably headlights from a car passing outside. My house sits near a narrow road outside a small town in northern Georgia. Sometimes cars drive by late at night, and their lights sweep across the walls if the angle is right. That explanation felt reasonable enough. But something about the glow still bothered me. Headlights move. This light hadn't moved. It had simply appeared. I swung my legs out of bed and walked to the window. The blinds rattled softly when I lifted them. Outside, the yard was dark and still. The gravel driveway stretched out toward the road about 50 feet away. No cars, no headlights disappearing around the bend. The air looked clear. No fog or mist that might reflect light. I leaned a little closer to the glass and listened. The road was empty. After a minute, I let the blinds fall back into place and went back to bed. Sleep didn't come easily after that. I kept staring at the ceiling, waiting for the light to return. Eventually, I must have drifted off. The next thing I remember was waking up again. This time, I didn't see the light right away. I felt it, a faint brightness through my closed eyelids. I opened my eyes slowly. The ceiling was glowing again, same pale white light, maybe a little brighter than before. I stayed completely still. The glow didn't flicker. It didn't move across the ceiling like headlights would. It just hung there. I checked the clock again, 2:23 a.m. The light lasted longer this time, maybe 4 seconds, then it faded the same way as before, slowly dimming until the room was dark again. I sat up. Something about the pattern made me uneasy. 2 lights, 7 minutes apart. I grabbed my phone and opened the weather app, half expecting to see a storm rolling through. Clear skies, no lightning reported anywhere nearby. I thought about going outside to check the yard, but the idea didn't feel appealing for reasons I couldn't explain. Instead, I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the house. The refrigerator clicked off in the kitchen. The silence after that felt heavier. I glanced toward the ceiling again. Dark. After a minute, I stood up and walked into the hallway. The living room window faces the road, so I figured if headlights were causing the light, I'd see cars passing there. The living room looked normal. Moonlight faintly outlined the furniture. I parted the curtains and looked outside. The road was empty. The nearest streetlight sits about 100 yards down the hill, and its glow barely reached my yard. I stood there for a while, waiting. Nothing passed. Eventually, I went back into the bedroom. The air felt slightly cooler now, like the window might be open somewhere. But when I checked it, the window was shut tight. I got back into bed and lay there staring at the ceiling again. A few minutes passed, then the glow returned. This time it came on faster. The ceiling brightened almost instantly. The pale light spread across the entire surface. I held my breath. The brightness stayed steady for maybe 5 seconds. Then something changed. The center of the ceiling grew slightly brighter than the edges, like the light source had shifted closer to that spot. I stared at it, trying to make sense of it. For a moment, I thought I could see the faint outline of the ceiling fan shadowing the glow. But the fan wasn't moving, and the light wasn't coming from the direction of the window. It seemed to be coming from above the house. The glow faded again. The room returned to darkness. I sat there in the quiet for a long time after that. Eventually, I checked the clock. 2:31 a.m. I must have fallen asleep again sometime after that. When I woke up in the morning, sunlight was coming through the blinds like normal. The ceiling looked ordinary. For a while, I convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. But when I walked into the kitchen to make coffee, I noticed something strange. The digital clock on the microwave had reset. It blinked 12 on, which meant the power had gone out at some point during the night. But the bedside clock in my room still showed the correct time, and I didn't remember the lights flickering at all. Later that evening, I stepped outside around sunset to check the roof gutters. While I was standing in the yard, I looked up at the house. The roofline cast a shadow across the upper part of the bedroom window. For a second, I imagined what the ceiling would look like if a bright light were hovering directly above the house. The pattern of brightness across the plaster came back to me exactly the way I'd seen it, even the brighter spot in the center. I stood there staring at the roof for a while. Then I went back inside and made sure the blinds were closed again before it got dark. The fog started about 10 miles outside of town. It was early morning, just after 5, and I was driving east on Route 47 toward the warehouse where I worked. My shift started at 6, and the drive usually took about 40 minutes if traffic was light. That morning there was almost no traffic at all. The road runs through farmland most of the way. Long stretches of fields and the occasional farmhouse set back from the road. Normally you can see for miles out there, but that day the fog rolled in thick and low. At first it was just patches hanging over the fields. Then it got denser until the headlights barely reached beyond the front of the car. I slowed down to about 40 and kept both hands on the wheel. The radio was playing quietly some early news station out of Springfield, but the signal kept fading in and out as the fog thickened. It felt like driving through milk. The road markers appeared 1 second and vanished the next. About 15 minutes into the drive, I saw the lights. They were far ahead in the fog, 2 headlights floating above the road. At first, I felt relieved. Another car meant someone else was dealing with the same bad visibility. The lights looked steady and bright, maybe a quarter mile away, but something about them didn't sit right. They were too high. Not dramatically higher, just enough that they seemed slightly above where a car's headlights should be. I leaned forward a little in my seat. The fog made everything hard to judge, so I figured it was just the angle. Maybe the road dipped ahead or the car was cresting a small hill. I kept driving. The lights stayed in the same spot. They didn't get closer, didn't get farther away either, just hung there in the fog. The radio crackled again, then went silent. For a moment, the only sound inside the car was the tires hissing against the damp pavement. I checked the speedometer, still doing about 40. The lights ahead should have been getting closer, but they weren't. They stayed the same distance away, glowing faintly through the fog. I glanced down at the clock on the dashboard. 5:24 a.m. When I looked back up, the lights were still there, still hovering above the road. I remember thinking maybe it was a truck parked somewhere ahead, facing my direction. But the road was straight for miles. If it was parked, I should have reached it by then. Instead, the distance between us never changed. I drove like that for another minute, staring through the fog at the floating headlights. Then something else occurred to me. I couldn't see the body of the vehicle, just the lights. Usually, even in fog, you can make out the faint outline of a car or truck once you get close enough. But there was nothing behind them, just fog. I slowed down even more. 35, 30. The lights didn't react. They stayed where they were. The fog around them looked slightly brighter, like the glow was spreading through it. I rolled down my window halfway. Cold air drifted into the car. I listened for an engine. Nothing. Just the faint whistle of wind and the soft sound of my own tires. The lights remained completely still. Then they moved. Not forward. Up. Just a little. Maybe a few feet. I blinked hard, thinking the fog had shifted, but the lights were definitely higher than before. Now they were clearly floating above the road. I slowed the car almost to a crawl. The lights stayed in place. For a moment, they seemed to flicker slightly, though it might have just been the fog swirling around them. Then the fog began to thin. It happened gradually. The thick gray wall ahead started to break apart, revealing more of the road. I kept my eyes locked on the lights, waiting to see the vehicle they belonged to. The fog cleared enough that I could see the pavement ahead for at least 100 yards. There was nothing there. No car, no truck, just the empty road stretching forward, but the headlights were still visible. Now they hovered well above the asphalt, maybe 20 feet in the air. I slowed the car to a complete stop. My engine idled quietly in the silence. The lights stayed there for another few seconds. Then they drifted sideways, not fast, just a smooth slide toward the field on the right side of the road. Still silent, still glowing the same dull yellow. They moved maybe 50 feet across the open air. Then they faded, not suddenly, just dimmed until they blended into the fog. The road ahead was empty. I sat there gripping the steering wheel for a moment before easing my foot back onto the gas. As I drove past the spot where the lights had been, I looked out into the field. The ground was flat and damp from overnight dew. No vehicles, no structures, just rows of cut corn stubble disappearing into the fog. I kept driving the rest of the way to work. The fog thinned out completely about 5 miles later. By the time I reached the warehouse, the sky was already starting to brighten with early morning light. Everything looked normal again. But when I parked and shut off the engine, I realized something odd. The clock on the dashboard read 5:46. That didn't make sense. From the last time I checked it, 5:24, it shouldn't have taken that long to reach the warehouse, even with the fog. And I couldn't remember the last 10 minutes of the drive very clearly. Just the empty road, and the feeling that I'd been watching my rearview mirror for lights that never appeared. I noticed the feeling before I noticed the sky. I was about 3 blocks from my apartment, walking home along a quiet street near the river. It was just after midnight, and the air had that cool, damp smell you get in early spring when the snow is mostly gone, but the ground still holds moisture. The streetlights were spaced far apart, leaving long, dark stretches between them. My footsteps echoed faintly off the parked cars lining the curb. I'd been at my friend Marcus's place watching a late basketball game and stayed longer than I planned. By the time I started walking home, the neighborhood had gone quiet. No traffic, no people outside, just the low hum of distant highway noise and the occasional creak of branches in the wind. I had my hands in my jacket pockets and was staring down at the sidewalk when the feeling hit me. It wasn't fear exactly, more like a sudden awareness, like someone had just started looking at me. I stopped walking. The quiet around the street seemed to thicken. I turned around slowly, scanning the houses behind me. All the windows were dark. One porch light down the block flickered slightly, but there was no movement anywhere. I listened for footsteps or voices. Nothing. After a few seconds, I shook it off and kept walking. But the feeling stayed. That same strange sense of being watched. It wasn't coming from behind me or from the houses. It felt higher. I glanced up at the rooftops on both sides of the street. Nothing there either. Just antennas and chimneys silhouetted against the sky. Then I looked higher. The sky above the street was clear, full of stars. The river valley gets pretty dark at night, so you can see a lot more stars there than in the city center. For a few seconds, I just stood there looking up. Then I noticed one of them moving. It was faint, barely brighter than the others, drifting slowly across the sky. At first, I assumed it was a satellite. I see them sometimes when the sky is clear. The light moved steadily from west to east, sliding past the other stars. I started walking again, still watching it. The movement was smooth, silent, normal. Then it stopped. Not slowed down. Stopped. I blinked a few times to make sure my eyes weren't playing tricks on me. The light stayed exactly where it was. The stars around it remained steady. Only that one had moved. Now it just hung there. Perfectly still. I slowed my pace until I was barely moving. Something about the way it stopped made my chest tighten. Satellites don't stop. At least I'd never seen one do that. I stood in the middle of the sidewalk, staring straight up. The light stayed frozen in place. The street around me was quiet enough that I could hear the faint ripple of water from the river a block away. Then the light shifted, not forward, sideways, just a tiny movement to the left. Then it stopped again. My stomach did that slow sinking thing you get when something doesn't make sense. I stepped backward into the edge of a driveway so I could see more of the sky between the houses. The star remained still. I counted slowly in my head. 1, 2, 3, 5. 10 seconds. Then it faded. Not like a shooting star or a flare burning out, it just dimmed, slowly, until it blended into the sky. I kept staring at the spot where it had been. The surrounding stars looked exactly the same. Nothing moved anymore. I stood there another minute, waiting to see if it would come back. It didn't. Eventually, I started walking again. The strange watched feeling faded gradually, like someone had turned their attention somewhere else. By the time I reached the corner near my building, the street felt normal again. The hallway light inside the apartment building buzzed faintly as I pushed through the front door. I climbed the stairs to the second floor and unlocked my apartment. The place was quiet and still. I dropped my keys on the counter and walked over to the window that faces the river. For a moment, I considered stepping onto the fire escape to look at the sky again. Instead, I just stood there inside the room, staring out through the glass. The sky above the buildings was empty now. Stars scattered across it like always, nothing moving. Eventually I went to bed, but when I checked my phone before turning off the light, I noticed the time. 12:38 a.m. That didn't seem right. Marcus's place is only about a 10-minute walk from my apartment. I was sure I'd left around midnight, and the walk home had felt longer than usual, though I couldn't explain why. I set the phone down and turned off the lamp. The room went dark. For a few seconds, I stared up at the ceiling. Then, through the thin gap in the curtains, I thought a faint point of light outside shift slightly in the sky. But when I sat up to look more closely, it was already gone. I stepped outside because the dog wouldn't stop pacing. It was early, still dark, maybe 20 minutes before dawn. My dog Milo had been restless since around 5, walking back and forth across the living room and whining softly near the door. He does that sometimes when he hears raccoons outside, so I figured I'd let him out into the yard and get a little fresh air myself. The air had that cool, damp feel you get right before sunrise. Late October in central Kansas, the ground still holding the night's cold. There was a faint fog hanging low across the fields behind my house. I opened the back door, and Milo trotted out ahead of me onto the grass. He usually runs straight to the fence, but this time he stopped halfway across the yard and just stood there, ears up. Looking toward the horizon, I followed his gaze. At first, I thought I was looking at the moon. There was a bright white orb sitting low above the fields behind the tree line, maybe 10 degrees above the horizon. It was big enough that I noticed it immediately, but it didn't look like the moon. The light was too clean, too sharp. The sky around it was still dark blue, the kind of color you get before the first real sunlight appears. The stars were fading slowly as the sky brightened, but that orb stood out against everything. Perfectly round, bright white, no flickering. I leaned against the doorframe and stared at it. For a moment, I assumed it had to be a plane or maybe a helicopter coming toward town. But there were no blinking lights and no sound at all. The brightness didn't hurt to look at, but it was strong enough that it cast a faint glow across the fog in the fields. Milo gave a low whine. I stepped down onto the grass. The ground felt damp through my shoes. The orb didn't move. It hovered there just above the horizon, steady and silent. The longer I watched it, the stranger it felt. Normally, when something is low like that near the horizon, you can see it drift slowly upward as the earth rotates or as dawn approaches. But this one stayed exactly where it was. Then it moved. Not up, down. At first, I thought my eyes were adjusting to the light and playing tricks on me. But the orb definitely dropped lower, just a few inches at first, relative to the tree line. I took a few steps forward in the yard. "Do you see that?" I muttered, even though Milo obviously couldn't answer. The orb continued sinking, slowly, perfectly straight down. The motion was smooth, like it was sliding on invisible rails. My first thought was that maybe it was setting behind the horizon the way the moon sometimes does, but that didn't make sense either. The sun hadn't risen yet, and the sky was still dark enough that the stars were visible above it. And whatever this was, it was too bright and too low. I checked the sky around it. No clouds, no aircraft, just that single bright sphere lowering itself toward the tree line. The fog across the field seemed to glow faintly as the light moved closer to it. I realized I hadn't heard any morning sounds yet. No birds, no wind in the trees. Even the highway a mile away was quiet. The orb kept descending. Now it was almost touching the tops of the distant trees. I waited for it to pass behind them. Instead, it continued downward. The trees blocked the lower edge of it for a second. Then more of the light disappeared behind the tree line. Within maybe 5 seconds, the orb sank completely out of view, just gone behind the trees. I stood there staring at the empty horizon. The fog drifted slowly across the fields again. Nothing came back up. No glow, no reflection, just the faint gray outline of the trees. Milo walked over to me and pressed against my leg. The sky above us was starting to lighten now, this turning from deep blue to a dull gray. The first bird called somewhere behind the house. I stayed out there for another minute, waiting to see if the light would rise again somewhere else along the horizon. It didn't. Eventually, Milo wandered back toward the door, and I followed him inside. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table looking out the window toward the same stretch of fields. The sun finally rose about 15 minutes later. Normal sunrise. Soft orange light spreading across the horizon exactly where it should. Nothing bright or strange above the trees. But when I stepped outside later that morning to grab the mail, I noticed something odd. The grass in the far field behind my property looked darker in a small patch near the tree line, almost like the fog had burned away unevenly, right where the orb had disappeared. I was camping alone in the Bitterroot Range, not far from an old trailhead my uncle used to take me to when I was a kid. I picked a small clearing near a creek, flat enough for my tent, far enough from the water that I wouldn't wake up freezing. It was late September, cool but not cold, and the air smelled like pine sap and damp dirt. I'd gotten there late in the afternoon and spent most of the daylight setting up camp and collecting deadfall for the fire. By the time I finished eating, the sun had dropped behind the ridge. The sky was still light, but the forest itself had already turned dark, that kind of soft, shadowy darkness where everything looks like it's holding its breath. I remember poking at the fire with a stick, listening to the usual forest sounds, crickets, the creek, occasional rustling from small animals. Then it all stopped. Not gradually, not fading, everything just ceased. The creek still ran, but even that seemed quieter somehow, like someone had put a wall between me and the sound. I lifted my head, waiting for the insects to start up again, but the silence stayed thick and absolute. Even the wind, which had been moving the branches overhead a few seconds earlier, was suddenly gone. I sat perfectly still, the stick hovering above the fire. I didn't want to make a sound. I didn't want whatever caused that silence to notice me. After maybe 30 seconds, I'm guessing since it felt both short and long, I heard a soft, short snap of a twig from deeper in the trees. Not close, not far, not far. Just enough to make my pulse jump. I myself it was a deer or a raccoon or something normal, but the silence made it impossible to believe that. Forest noise cuts out sometimes when predators are nearby, sure, but this felt different, too complete, too controlled. I stood slowly and took a step back from the fire, back closer to my tent. The air felt heavier, like it was pressing in on my ears. I rubbed one of them without thinking. It didn't pop. It didn't relieve anything. Then I saw it. Between two large trees, maybe 20 yards away, something shimmered in the air. At first, I thought it was heat distortion, like the wavy look above asphalt in the summer. But the night air was cold enough that I'd been seeing my own breath moments before. The shimmer wasn't rising or drifting. It just hung there in a vertical patch, maybe 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall. I leaned slightly to the right. The shimmer shifted with me, not like it was reacting, more like it was layered over the trees, adjusting so that it always stayed directly in my line of sight. If I had taken one more step, I swear it would have still been centered between those two trees. I whispered, "No," without realizing it. The shimmer brightened, only a little, but enough to outline the shape more clearly. It wasn't a shape, exactly. More like a window made of distorted air. A cutout where the forest behind it didn't match the rest of what I was seeing. The background was wrong. Out of focus, but not blurred. Just wrong. I blinked hard. The shimmer pulsed once. Not light, not color. Just a change, like a ripple passing through a thin sheet. The forest stayed silent. I reached for my flashlight, which was clipped to the tent zipper. My fingers brushed it, but something in me refused to actually grab it. I was afraid of what would happen if I pointed a beam at the shimmer, afraid it would respond. Another twig snapped, this one closer, behind the shimmer. I couldn't see anything moving there, but I heard it clearly. Not gradual footsteps, just one deliberate crack of something stepping down. The shimmer flickered, then dissolved, not faded, not moved. It just broke apart like dust being scattered into nothing. The space between the trees returned to normal instantly. The forest sounds didn't return right away. I waited 5, maybe 10 seconds before I heard a single cricket start up again, then another. Then the creak grew louder, like someone slowly turning up a volume knob. When the wind came back, it rustled the branches hard enough that I flinched. Everything went back to normal. I stood there staring at the empty spot between the trees for a long time. I wanted to believe the whole thing was a trick of my eyes, some kind of optical illusion from the firelight, but the silence hadn't been an illusion, and the distortion had reacted when I moved. I finally forced myself to sit back down by the fire. I didn't add more wood. I didn't eat anything else. I just sat there, listening, trying to figure out if I should pack up and hike out in the dark. The trail was narrow and rocky, and I didn't trust myself not to twist an ankle in the panic that would definitely hit once I left the circle of firelight. After maybe 20 minutes, the forest felt normal again. Too normal. Every sound made me jump. The snap of a pine cone, the flap of a moth's wings near the fire, even the steady gurgling of the creek. I didn't sleep much. Every time I started drifting off, the forest would go quiet for 1 or 2 seconds, and I'd snap awake, convinced it was happening again. It never did, not exactly. But around 3 in the morning, I heard something move down by the creek. Not an animal sound, just a single splash, like something lightly touching the water without stepping into it. When the sky finally started turning gray, I broke camp fast. I shoved everything into my pack, barely rolling up the tent. The trail back to my truck felt longer than the hike in. I kept glancing over my shoulder even though I knew that whatever I'd seen or thought I'd seen wouldn't be walking behind me like an animal. When I got home that evening, my clothes still smelled like smoke and pine, but the cold knot in my stomach stuck around for days. The forest had gone completely silent again in my memory, perfect and absolute, and my ears kept replaying that stillness. I tried telling my uncle about it the next week when he called to check in. I didn't mention the shimmer at first, I just said the woods had gone quiet. He got serious and said he'd had that happen once, years ago, near a different section of the Bitterroots. He said he didn't stick around long enough to see anything else. I didn't tell him the rest. Even now, when I think about the way that distortion shifted to match my view, I feel the same pressure in my ears that I felt that night, like the air around me remembers. I was driving back from my cousin's place in McCall late on a Sunday night, taking the forest road that cuts between the lake and the ridge. I'd left way later than I meant to, sometime after 11 p.m., and the temperature had dropped enough that a thick fog was hanging low over the road. My headlights were basically pushing through a wall of white. I had the window cracked because the air inside the car felt stale, and every now and then I'd catch the smell of wet pine drifting in. The fog got heavier as I climbed, the kind that moves in slow sheets across the road instead of just sitting still. I kept my speed around 20. I'd taken that road 100 times, but that night I felt weirdly tense, like I was driving somewhere unfamiliar. Even the turns looked sharper, the trees taller. I was rounding a bend when something dark showed through the fog, something above the treetops on my right. I didn't see it all at once. It was more like I caught the absence of light first, a patch where the faint glow of the sky was blocked out. I lifted my foot off the gas. The shape didn't move. It just hovered there, a long, smooth silhouette suspended above the ridgeline. Not a plane, not a helicopter. It didn't blink, didn't shine, didn't pulse. Just a quiet, solid darkness hanging in place. I thought maybe it was some kind of optical illusion created by the fog, so I rolled the window down a little farther and leaned to get a better angle. Cold air rushed in, my ears popped slightly. The shape stayed. The fog swirled around it, drifting past as though it wasn't solid at all, but it had edges, clean ones. The bottom looked slightly curved, like the hull of a boat turned upside down. I couldn't see the top. It disappeared into thicker fog. My car slowed almost to a crawl. I didn't remember letting it. I tried to convince myself it was just a cloud formation or a shadow from the ridge. But clouds don't stay that still, and shadows don't hang higher than the trees when there's no moon out. As I approached the next straight stretch of road, the fog ahead thinned suddenly, opening into a clearer pocket. The headlights cut farther. I could see the tops of the pines again. And the shape wasn't there. No movement, no fading, just gone, like someone switching off a slide. The sky behind the trees looked completely normal. I didn't breathe for a few seconds. My hands were gripping the wheel so tightly that my thumb ached. I kept checking the mirrors, expecting to see the shape behind me, but I only saw shifting fog and my own red taillights reflected back. I took a few more curves slowly. The fog drifted in and out, thickening, thinning, then thickening again. Every time it cleared, I scanned the sky. Nothing. A few minutes later, I noticed the radio had gone silent. Not static, silent. The display was still on, showing the station number, but the audio had cut out completely. I turned the knob up. Nothing. I switched stations. The numbers changed, but still no sound. That never happens out there. If anything, the radio gets fuzzy near the ridge, but it doesn't just die. My chest felt tight, not in a panic way, more like when you're underwater and your body tells you something isn't right. I rolled the window up, then down again, trying to steady my breathing. The cold air helped, but the pressure didn't go away. A quarter mile later, the fog thinned again, and I saw something pale drift across the road ahead. Just a faint streak, like a beam of light sliding sideways through the trees. It didn't look like a car's headlights. It moved too slow, too smooth, and there was no vehicle around to cast it. The light faded between the trunks and vanished. I slowed even more. My hazard lights were on before I realized I'd hit the button. The road looked empty. The trees were still. Nothing made sense. When I reached the turnout overlook, I pulled in and turned off the engine. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to hear the forest, or maybe I needed to convince myself I wasn't losing it. The fog here was thinner, drifting in soft patches across the ground. I stepped out and listened. At first, everything sounded normal. Wind in the branches, a few insects, my own footsteps on gravel. Then the forest got quiet. Not silent, just muffled, like someone had put a layer of insulation between me and every sound. Even my breathing sounded distant in my ears. I looked toward the trees. A thin veil of fog curled around the pines. And for a second, just a second, I thought I saw a darker shape within the fog. Not as big as the thing I'd seen above the trees earlier, but a smooth curve, almost like the corner of the same object. I blinked. The fog shifted. The shape disappeared. I waited, staring at the same patch of forest until my eyes watered. Nothing changed. When I finally got back in the car, the radio came back on by itself, mid-song, volume low, like nothing had happened. I nearly jumped out of my skin. The dashboard clock, which had been reading 11:42 when I parked, now showed 11:48. I hadn't been outside that long. I drove the rest of the way home barely noticing the road. The fog thinned out a few miles later, and by the time I reached town, the sky was clear enough to see stars. The next morning, everything looked normal. No weird fog, no strange pressure in my chest. The car started fine, radio worked perfectly. But when I checked the paint near the top of the passenger door, don't ask me why, I just felt like I should. I found a single faint streak like something had drawn a finger across the metal. Not a scratch, not dirt, just a clean, dull line cutting through the dew. It wiped away instantly. I stood there longer than I needed to, staring at the empty driveway, waiting to feel something, fear, relief, anything. What I felt instead was the same strange tightness in my chest I'd felt on the road, like something above me was remembering the sound it made. I was taking a late walk around my neighborhood, something I'd been doing more often since I started working from home. It was close to midnight, cool enough that I could see my breath, but not cold enough to be uncomfortable. The houses on my street are spaced out, single-story ranch-style places with big front yards and barely any streetlights. It always felt safe, quiet, predictable. That night felt normal at first. I remember hearing a dog bark a few streets over and someone's wind chime clinking softly. The air smelled like pine and chimney smoke. I walked with my hands in my hoodie pockets, following the sidewalk past the Miller place, then the old brick house that's been empty for years. When I rounded the corner onto Ledgewood Drive, the neighborhood opened up a little. Fewer trees, wider yards, clearer view of the sky. I don't know why I looked up then, probably the way the moonlight hit something, but I did. That's when I saw it. A pale orb hovered above a rooftop about 2 blocks away. Not high in the sky, just maybe 20 or 30 feet above the shingles. It wasn't bright, it wasn't glowing like a lamp or a drone. It looked more like a soft, diffused sphere of light, the way fog sometimes glows around a street lamp, except there was nothing to illuminate it. It just hung there, perfectly still. I stopped walking without thinking. My brain tried to categorize it. A drone, maybe? A reflection? A security light? But it wasn't throwing any light onto the roof below. It wasn't flickering. It didn't strobe like aircraft lights. It looked self-contained. I stepped closer, moving slowly down the sidewalk, trying not to blink. The orb didn't react. It just existed there over the roofline of a dark house I didn't recognize. I didn't see any movement inside, no porch lights, nothing. As I got closer, the silence hit me. The dog barking earlier had stopped, the wind chimes too. Even the sound of distant cars was gone. It felt like someone had sucked all the noise out of the night. My footsteps on the pavement sounded too loud, too sharp. I slowed down again. The orb stayed exactly where it was, maybe the size of a basketball, maybe a little bigger. The light didn't spread. It was confined to that sphere, pale and even like the color of a dim LED. Then it dimmed slightly, just a subtle shift, but enough for me to notice. It was like someone slowly turning down a dimmer switch, not abruptly, but with intention. I froze, half hidden behind a mailbox. The orb continued to dim, but it didn't shrink or drift. It didn't fall or rise. It just became fainter in place, like it was dissolving into the darkness. Then, for a moment, it stabilized, still visible, but barely. I held my breath. A few seconds passed, maybe 10. Then the orb dimmed again, this time faster, until it looked no brighter than a faint smudge of moonlight, and then it was gone. No movement, no streak, no sound, just gone, as if someone had erased it from the air. I waited where I was, listening. Still nothing. After a moment, the normal sounds returned. A car engine in the distance, a gust of wind moving through leaves, a porch light buzzing. It all came back at once, like the neighborhood had been paused. I stepped slowly toward the house where the orb had been. The air felt colder near it. Not freezing, just enough to notice. The house itself looked completely ordinary. 2 windows, shut curtains, no lights on. I didn't recognize the car in the driveway, but I don't pay attention to neighbors' cars much. I stood at the edge of the sidewalk, staring at the spot where the orb had hovered. There was nothing there now, just a blank patch of night sky. For some reason, I checked my watch. 12:08 a.m. I glanced at my phone. 11:57 p.m. I frowned. My watch isn't digital. It doesn't resync itself. I'd wound it earlier that day, and it had been accurate. Somehow it had jumped ahead 11 minutes. I walked home faster than I meant to. Every tree shadow felt off, like they were slightly out of place. I kept glancing up at rooftops, half expecting to see another pale orb resting above them. Nothing else appeared. When I got back into my house, the air inside felt warmer, normal. The heater kicked on. The refrigerator hummed. The dull buzz of the street lamp outside drifted through the window. But when I checked my watch again, it still read 12:08, even though my phone now said 11:59. The next morning, my watch had corrected itself. Or maybe corrected isn't the right word. It drifted back to the right time, minute by minute, until it matched my phone exactly. Like whatever had happened wasn't permanent. I walked past that house again later that day. It looked even more ordinary in daylight. Fresh paint, trimmed hedges, nothing weird about it at all. But I kept glancing at the roof. I didn't see anything. Still, When night came again, I closed the blinds a little tighter than usual. And before I went to bed, I checked all the clocks in the house, twice, just to make sure none of them had jumped ahead on their own. They hadn't. But around midnight, for a few seconds, the neighborhood went quiet again. Quiet in that same unnatural way, like the world was waiting for something to appear just above the roofs. I was parked at Eagle Crest Lookout, just outside Flagstaff, the one off the old service road, where people sometimes go to watch meteor showers. It was a cold, dry night in late November, the kind where the air has that brittle edge and even small sounds seem to travel too far. I'd driven up there after work to clear my head, not planning anything special, just needed a quiet place to sit for a while. I killed the engine, but kept the radio on low, some late-night talk show murmuring about highway closures. The sky was clear, except for a thin band of clouds along the western ridge. I reclined the seat, cracked the window an inch, and watched the stars. A couple cars had passed earlier on the main road, but by the time it hit 11:30, I was alone. The first strange thing was how suddenly the wind stopped. One moment the air moved lightly through the pines, and the next it was perfectly still. The silence didn't feel normal. It had that thick, padded quality, like the world had been muted. I sat up a little, listening. Then the car vibrated. Just once, not violently, not even aggressively, more like a soft, controlled thump from underneath, as if someone had shoved the frame with an open palm. The kind of vibration you'd get if a heavy object landed nearby, except nothing had landed. The ground was solid rock around the lookout. My hands froze on the steering wheel, even though the engine wasn't running. I glanced at the rearview mirror out of instinct. Nothing behind me but the empty pull-off and a stretch of trees. I turned the radio off and listened. Nothing. Not the wind, not insects, not distant traffic. Just that same oppressive quiet. I sat completely still, waiting to see if the vibration would happen again. Maybe 30 seconds passed, maybe less. Hard to tell. My sense of time felt slightly off, like everything was stretching. I remember exhaling slowly to steady myself. Then a faint light appeared on the horizon. Not a beam, not a flare, just a small, diffuse glow sliding horizontally across the tree line. It looked too low to be a plane and too steady to be a reflection. The best way to describe it is that it moved like someone dragging a flashlight behind a frosted window, except the window was the sky. The light didn't brighten or dim. It held the same soft intensity as it traveled, gliding in a straight, deliberate path. I leaned forward, squinting. There were no roads out that direction, no houses, no towers, nothing that would cast a light like that. The glow continued sliding for another few seconds, then paused, just a tiny hesitation, like it had stopped to consider something. The edges of the clouds around it brightened slightly, but not enough to spill real illumination. Then the light dipped downward, almost imperceptibly, and vanished. Not faded, vanished, like someone had switched it off. I waited for any kind of after effect, a sound, a second vibration, a gust of wind, but the silence stayed absolute. My heartbeat felt like the loudest thing in the car. I turned the key to accessory mode and checked the dashboard clock. 11:48 p.m. Something about that bothered me immediately, though I couldn't figure out why at first. I checked the time right when I parked. I remembered it being 11:32. 15 or 16 minutes shouldn't have felt strange, but it did. It felt wrong. The amount of time between the vibration and the light disappearing didn't match that number in my mind. I picked up my phone. 11:43. 5 minutes difference. That wasn't normal, not for my car clock, which had always matched my phone to the minute. I stared at the numbers longer than necessary, trying to force them to make sense. I couldn't shake the feeling that a few seconds had felt like minutes, or the opposite. Something had stretched or compressed, subtle enough that I only noticed when comparing clocks. I turned off the car completely and stepped outside with my hands shoved deep in my jacket pockets. The cold hit immediately. My breath formed quick white puffs that hung in place longer than they should have. The sky above the lookout was clear as ever. No light, no movement. Not even a plane crossing overhead. I walked slowly to the edge of the pull-off and looked toward the horizon where the light had vanished. The clouds there looked normal now. Thin, harmless, drifting lazily. I waited, half expecting the glow to reappear or something else to move behind the clouds. Nothing did. I was about to head back to the car when I noticed something odd. The air felt heavier a few feet from where I stood. Not colder, not warmer, just thick, like stepping into low humidity after being in dry air. My ears buzzed faintly, as if pressure had changed. I stepped back and the sensation faded. I stepped forward again, and it returned. It was concentrated in a small patch of space, maybe 2 or 3 feet wide. No shimmer, no light, no visual distortion, just this subtle physical presence, like the air wasn't behaving quite the same. I backed away slowly until the buzzing in my ears eased. The wind returned all at once. A strong gust pushed through the overlook, rattling the branches and carrying a rush of pine scent. The sudden noise startled me more than the silence had. It felt like the world had remembered to turn itself back on. I got into the car, locked the doors, and started the engine. The dashboard clock now read 11:50. My phone still said 11:43. The mismatch made my stomach flip, but I forced myself not to stare at it. I pulled out of the lookout and drove toward town, keeping one eye on the sky. Every few miles, I checked the clocks again. They stayed out of sync until I passed the highway turnoff. 3 minutes later, they matched perfectly. When I got home, I didn't turn on any lights. I sat in the dark in my driveway for a while, listening to the ticking of the cooling engine and watching the empty stretch of road leading up toward the mountains. Nothing followed me. Nothing appeared. But sometimes, especially on clear nights, I think about the feeling right before the vibration. The strange quiet, the sudden stillness, the sense that the air around me was waiting. And I wonder if that faint light on the horizon wasn't moving across it at all. I wonder if it was passing behind something I simply couldn't see. I was driving back from Redding after visiting my friend Nate, taking Highway 299 toward Weaverville. It was close to midnight, the kind of late where the road feels separate from the rest of the world. No traffic in either direction, no houses for long stretches, and just enough moonlight to outline the tops of the pines. The air was cold and dry, the sky unusually clear for that time of year. I wasn't tired, just bored, letting some quiet AM talk station fill the silence. The road curved gently left and right, nothing sharp, and I kept a steady speed. It was one of those drives where you start thinking about random stuff because there's nothing else to grab your attention. Then something caught my eye, barely noticeable at first. A glint, a reflection. High above the road, maybe 50 or 60 feet up. My headlights bounced off something metallic for just a second, like the way light hits a moving road sign at the wrong angle. I slowed a little and leaned forward, trying to figure out what I'd seen. There were no signs there, no overpasses, nothing hanging above the highway. Just open air and the dark silhouette of trees. I kept driving but stayed alert. A few seconds later, the reflection appeared again, this time more definite. A smooth, curved surface. Not big, but not small either, maybe the size of a compact car. It hovered above the right side of the road, high enough that I had to crane my neck to keep track of it through the windshield. My foot eased off the gas without me thinking about it. The thing didn't move like anything I recognized. It didn't bob or sway or drift. It stayed perfectly still, suspended in open air, catching the edge of my headlights in a soft, quick flare. I slowed to almost 40, watching it from the corner of my eye. It wasn't a drone. There were no lights on it, no blinking indicators, no noise, nothing mechanical at all. The only reason I knew it was there was because of those faint reflections when my headlights hit its surface at just the right angle. The object tilted. Not much, just a slight shift, like it was turning to look down the road. The reflection slid across its underside and vanished as if it had turned away from the beam. I hit the brakes harder than I meant to, and the car jerked slightly. My heart started pounding. I rolled down the window, expecting to hear something. Wind, a mechanical hum, anything. But the night was dead silent. I looked back up. The thing shot upward. No sound, no trail, no acceleration curve. Just an instantaneous upward movement, like something had yanked it straight up out of sight. One moment it was there, hovering above the pines. The next, it was just gone, swallowed by the darkness. I sat there in the middle of the highway with my hazard lights blinking, trying to process what I'd seen. The hairs on my arms were standing straight up. My breathing felt too loud inside the car. After maybe a minute, I pulled over onto the shoulder and stepped out. The air felt colder than before, as if the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in the seconds after the object vanished. I looked straight up and saw nothing. No clouds, no stars blocked out, just open sky. But something else unsettled me. The pines around the road weren't moving. Not even a hint of wind. Everything felt unnaturally still, like the world was holding its breath. I walked out a few feet from the car, looking up the entire time, half expecting the metallic shape to drift back into view. My ears rang slightly, though I couldn't tell if that was from the sudden quiet or my own pulse hammering in my head. I almost turned back to the car when I noticed something odd near the tree line. A faint shimmer, like heat distortion. Even though the air was cold, it lasted only a couple seconds, warping the outline of the branches, and then it faded. The trees snapped back into clarity. I didn't see any movement in the forest, but the sense of being watched, being observed from above, hit me so suddenly that I froze. The whole area felt open in a way it hadn't before, like the sky itself had widened. I got back in the car and locked the doors, which felt ridiculous even as I did it. Whatever I'd seen wasn't going to be stopped by a door lock. But it made me feel a little less exposed. I continued driving, slower now, checking the mirrors constantly. Every time my headlights swept across a reflective road sign, my stomach jumped, thinking I'd see that metallic shape again. But nothing appeared. 10 minutes later, as I came down a long grade, I noticed the sky ahead flicker, just once. A thin vertical flash, almost like lightning trapped inside a cloud, except there were no clouds. Then, everything was dark again. My dashboard clock read 12:42 a.m. I looked at my phone just to compare. It said 12:38, 4 minutes off. The car clock had been accurate when I left Reading. I remember checking it. I remember thinking I should get home around 1:15, but now it was ahead, just by a few minutes, but enough that it made my hands tighten on the wheel. The rest of the drive home was uneventful. By the time I reached the outskirts of Weaverville, the sky looked normal, the trees moved in a light breeze, and I started convincing myself that maybe I had overreacted. Maybe the object hadn't actually been hovering. Maybe it was some weird reflection off a low-flying aircraft. But when I pulled into my driveway and turned off the engine, the metallic taste in my mouth, sharp and chemical, made those explanations feel flimsy. I hadn't noticed it until then, but it hit me as soon as the headlights shut off. I sat there a long time before going inside, trying to convince myself that everything was normal. But every time I replayed the moment that thing tilted in the air, the feeling came back. The sense that it wasn't just moving, it was reacting. I woke up because my bedroom felt too quiet. Normally, I could hear the fridge humming in the kitchen or the water heater kicking on in the basement, but the house in Madison felt dead still, like the silence had weight to it. I rolled over to check the time on my phone, 4:58 a.m. I frowned. I knew I'd set an alarm for 7, but it wasn't going off. I unlocked the screen just to make sure I hadn't messed something up, and the moment the home screen loaded, the time shifted to 3:12 a.m. I stared at it, confused. I locked it and unlocked it again. Now it said 5:41 a.m. I sat up fast. The air in the room felt colder than when I went to bed, and I got the immediate sense something was off, like I'd walked into the wrong version of my house. I grabbed my phone, walked into the hallway, and checked the clock by the bathroom door. It was an old battery one I'd bought at a yard sale, usually slow by a minute or two, but reliable enough. 22:27. I actually laughed under my breath because it didn't make any sense. I went to the kitchen and checked the microwave. 7:52. The stove said 6:03. The coffee maker said 4:11. Every single device in the house showed a different time. None of them matched my phone. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, trying to figure out if there had been a power outage during the night. That wouldn't explain the battery-powered wall clock being wrong, but the rest could have blinked out and come back, except most of them were ahead, not behind. And not by the same amount, either. I checked my phone again. It said 4:58 a.m. again, like it had looped back. Then the screen flickered and jumped to 512. I turned it off immediately. The second the screen went dark, the fridge kicked on like someone had flipped a breaker. I walked to the back door, opened it a crack, and stuck my hand out. The air outside felt normal for April. Damp, mild, nothing strange. No storm, no wind, nothing that should have messed with the power. When I closed the door, the kitchen light flickered. Just once. A soft dimming like the bulb got tired for a second. I blew out a slow breath and checked my laptop on the dining table. It had gone to sleep overnight. I opened it. The lock screen loaded, and the time said 8:44 a.m. I hadn't been asleep that long. My body didn't feel it. My eyes weren't dry. I didn't feel groggy the way I do when I oversleep. And the sun wasn't up. I turned on the living room lamp. The bulb glowed normally for half a second, then brightened sharply, then settled into a dimmer level than before. I unplugged it. I didn't want to touch the knob. When I looked out the living room window, the street looked normal. A few porch lights on across the way. A car driving somewhere a block over. No weird glow in the sky, no strange fog. Everything looked completely ordinary. But the times weren't. I went back into the kitchen and opened the drawer with spare batteries. I swapped out the ones in the wall clock. When I put it back on the hook, the second hand started ticking and then stuttered like it was catching on something. It moved, paused, jumped forward, paused again, then spun quickly in a half circle before stopping altogether. I took it down again, heart pounding in a way I couldn't justify. I stared at the unmoving hands. They pointed to 3:19. Not any time it had shown before. The room felt colder again. Not freezing, just noticeably wrong for spring. I stepped toward the thermostat and checked it. It said 68 degrees, same as usual. I bumped it up to 70 and waited. No sound. No warm air. After 5 seconds, the screen faded slightly, like the backlight was dying. I stepped back. The basement door creaked. Not fully open, just a tiny shift in the frame, enough to make the hinge groan. That door never moved on its own. It stuck unless you pulled it. I stared at it, waiting. Nothing else happened. The cold feeling didn't fade, though. It settled in the air like mist you couldn't see. I walked into the living room again, more to get away from the basement than anything else, and checked the old VCR clock under the TV. I hadn't used that thing in years, but the time always stayed blinking at 12 unless I set it manually. Now it said 9:33. I could feel my pulse in my ears. I didn't know what else to do except turn on the TV to see if a news channel showed the real time. I grabbed the remote and hit the power button. The screen glowed gray. Not black like usual before a channel loads. Gray with faint bands of darker shade drifting across horizontally. No sound. No menu. I hit the power button again. The screen stayed gray for another second before cutting to black. The power light on the TV stayed on. I unplugged it. In the silence that followed, something upstairs creaked. I froze. My house was a single story, no upstairs. The attic was low and cramped, used only for insulation and storage, and the only access point was sealed with screws. The creak came again, slow. A shift in weight, like a board bending under something. I backed toward the hallway, feeling my hands start to shake. The microwave beeped. I spun around, startled hard enough that I almost slipped on the rug. The microwave door was slightly ajar. I hadn't touched it. The display now said 12:06. Different again. I shut the door gently and stepped away. My phone, lying on the counter, vibrated even though I'd turned it off. The screen lit up, not fully, just a glow without icons. When the home screen finally appeared, the clock showed 2:58, then 4:22, then 7:07, then 5:01. The seconds didn't change, only the minutes. I held the power button until it shut off again. The fridge's compressor suddenly stopped. The kitchen went quiet. Then the living room lamp unplugged, flickered once. Just a faint glow inside the bulb like a dying ember. That was when I grabbed my jacket and shoes and stood near the front door, willing myself to leave. I didn't want to stay in the house anymore. But the moment I touched the deadbolt, something made me freeze. The digital clock on the stove beeped again. The numbers were scrolling this time. Not cycling like they do when the power comes back, but scrolling upward quickly, as if time was being fast-forwarded. 6:10, 6:11, 6:12, 6:13. I stepped back from it. The scrolling slowed, then stopped on 6:14. The microwave changed to 8:02. The coffee maker blinked 3:55. My phone buzzed even though it was powered down. The attic creaked again. I don't know what pushed me to walk back toward the hallway, but I did. I stood under the attic hatch and listened. No movement, no sound, just the faint static in my ears from fear more than anything. Then the thermostat let out a faint click. I looked at it. The temperature readout now said 243. Not degrees, just 243 with no unit symbol. Then it blinked to 1119. Then 502. I reached for it, but stopped myself before touching anything. Something in the walls hummed, a soft electrical vibration that I felt more than heard. It pulsed once, twice, 3 times. Then everything went still. No hum, no creaking, no flickering lights. The kitchen display on the stove froze at 6:14. The microwave held at 8:02. The VCR still glowed 9:33. The wall clock remained unmoving in my hands, stuck at 3:19. I don't know how long I stood there before the heater finally kicked on like nothing had happened. Warm air started flowing through the vents. The fridge hummed back to life. A car drove by outside, normal as ever. I checked my phone again, letting it boot up fully this time. 7:06 a.m., the correct time. All my notifications showed normal timestamps. The signal was strong. The battery was stable. Nothing glitched. I walked through the house again. Every device was still wrong, each one showing a different time, but none of them were changing anymore. I opened the blinds to let in some of the early morning light, and the moment the sunlight hit the kitchen floor, the cold feeling lifted, like someone had cracked open a window on a stuffy day. I didn't try to fix any of the clocks. I didn't reset anything. I just left them the way they were. Every device frozen. At a different minute of a morning I had no memory of living. I noticed the weather alert first. It was 2:43 a.m. and my phone screen was glowing on the nightstand like I'd already picked it up and forgotten to put it back. The alert banner said, "Atmospheric disturbance in your area," which I'd never seen before. Not a storm warning, not high winds, just that phrase. I didn't remember waking up. I sat up slowly, trying to figure out why I was awake at all. My room in Laramie was dead quiet, the kind of quiet that felt heavy. No wind against the window, no distant trucks on the highway, nothing. I could see the faint orange streetlight bleeding in around the blinds. When I checked my phone, the first thing I noticed was the step count. 78 steps between 2:17 and 2:41. I stared at that number longer than I probably should have. My apartment was small, a living room, a kitchenette, and a bedroom. 78 steps meant I'd been walking around, not just standing or shifting in bed, walking. But I had no memory of getting up. I walked into the living room to see if anything looked disturbed. The air felt cooler than usual, even with the heater set to kick on overnight. The carpet had that slightly cold, almost damp feeling, though I didn't see any condensation on the windows. I touched the lock on the front door. It was engaged, but halfway between fully vertical and horizontal. Not unlocked, just not how I left it. I'm one of those people who checks the door twice before bed. I knew I'd turned it all the way. The deadbolt was still set, at least. I checked the kitchen, running through the usual worries. Did I leave the stove on? Did I forget to close the window? But everything was fine. My shoes were by the door. My jacket hung on the hook where I always left it. The weird part was that my keys were on the floor. Not far, just next to the entry rug, but I never leave them there. I always drop them in the ceramic bowl on the counter. Seeing them on the ground gave me a strange sinking feeling, like I'd been in a hurry earlier, even though I hadn't left the apartment all day. I went back to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. My phone buzzed again. Another alert. Atmospheric disturbance detected. Remain indoors. I opened the full notification, assuming it was from NOAA or the usual weather app, but it didn't say the source. Just a generic icon and text that didn't link anywhere. The timestamp flickered for half a second while I was reading it, like the screen glitched. I backed out and checked the step counter again. Now it said 83 steps. That made no sense because I hadn't walked anywhere since checking. I tried refreshing it. The number didn't change. Then the apartment lights flickered. Just once, really quick, but long enough that the shadows in the corners seemed to stretch and pull back. The hum of the refrigerator went quiet for a second before starting up again. The heater clicked off even though it wasn't supposed to. The silence after that felt sharper. I looked toward the window. The blinds moved slightly, like someone had brushed a hand across them from the outside. Just one narrow sway. I stood up but didn't go near it. My phone buzzed again, but when I checked it, there were no new notifications. Nothing at all. Even the weather alert had vanished from the history. Only the time showed 2:47 a.m. I opened the front-facing camera. I don't know why. Maybe to see if there was anything behind me. The image looked normal for a second before the exposure dropped sharply, like the room was darker than it really was. The background behind me warped slightly, the edges bending inward, as if the camera was struggling to process depth. Then it froze, just for a moment. The screen locked on an image of me with this distorted background shrinking toward a point behind my shoulder. I closed the app. When I walked back toward the living room, my socks picked up something cold on the carpet. I crouched down and touched it. The fibers were wet. A small patch, maybe the size of my palm, like someone had tracked in snow and it had melted. But the moisture wasn't near the door. It was near the center of the apartment, Memphis, nowhere close to anything that could have leaked. I checked the ceiling. Dry. No dripping. The heater clicked on again suddenly, blowing warm air across the room. It startled me enough that I stepped back, bumping into the coffee table. My phone vibrated again. This time it was the step counter. 106 steps since midnight. Before I could react, the apartment filled with a faint sound. A soft, low vibration. Not exactly a hum, more like the air had taken on a tone. You know how sometimes you can hear when a truck is idling outside, but you can't pinpoint the direction? It felt like that. All around me. Diffused. I looked at the window again. The blinds were completely still now, but I got a weird feeling that something was close to the exterior wall. Not touching it, just near it. My phone screen dimmed on its own, then brightened, then dimmed again. The battery percentage jumped from 68% to 54% in a second. The temperature reading said the device was cooling down, even though it was warm in my hand. Another weather alert popped up. Atmospheric disturbance. Severe. The word severe looked wrong. The font was slightly different, like it didn't match the rest of the system notifications. I tapped it, but nothing opened. The banner just shook once and faded away. I backed toward the bedroom, thinking maybe I was overtired or getting sick or something that made everything seem distorted and unfamiliar. But before I reached the doorway, the light in the hallway flickered again, this time in a pattern. Short, long, long, short. Almost like it was attempting something, or responding. The refrigerator hum cut out entirely. The whole apartment fell silent in a way I'd never heard before, not even the faint buzz of electronics. I held my breath. There was a soft tapping sound outside the living room window. Rhythmic. 3 taps. A pause. 2 taps. Another pause. Then 1 tap. Not like someone knocking, more like something lightly brushing or flicking the glass. I backed into the bedroom and closed the door partway. The tapping stopped, the low vibration in the air lessened, fading out bit by bit until it was gone. When everything went silent again, I checked the time. 3:11 a.m. I realized I didn't remember anything between 2:47 and then. No sense of time passing, no awareness of standing still. It felt like a jump cut in my memory. My step counter updated again. 143 steps between 2:50 and 3:09. I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to slow my breathing. The apartment felt normal again. Heater running, fridge humming, faint traffic noise outside. Nothing out of place, except the damp spot on the carpet had dried completely. Not even a shadow left behind. I stayed awake until the sky started turning pale around 6. I walked around the apartment checking everything. Locks, windows, vents. Nothing was disturbed. The weather alert history was empty again. My phone battery was back at 62% without being plugged in. The step counter still showed the movement, though. Every time I looked at that graph, a cold feeling settled into my stomach. The steps formed a looping pattern, back and forth, like pacing. More steps than the apartment had room for, unless I was walking in tight circles. I didn't remember any of it. When I left for work later that morning, the air outside felt normal. Clear. No wind. No strange pressure. But when I checked the weather app again around lunchtime, buried in the list of old notifications, was one last alert I hadn't seen before. It was timestamped 2:44 a.m. Atmospheric disturbance has passed, normal conditions resumed. It didn't match any official alert format, and somehow my phone had saved only that one. I woke up around 3:20 a.m., which isn't unusual for me, but the reason I woke up definitely was. It wasn't a noise from inside the house, not the heater kicking on or the fridge humming. It was something outside, low, steady, and far away, like turbines spinning in the distance. Not quite a helicopter, not quite an engine. More like a deep mechanical whir buried under layers of air. At first I thought it might be a semi on the highway a mile west of my place. But the sound didn't move the way trucks do. It didn't rise or fade. It just lingered, smooth and steady. I lay there a moment, listening. The room was cold, and when I sat up, the blanket slid off my shoulders like it didn't want to help. The turbine sound wasn't loud, but it filled the space in the same way wind sometimes does, everywhere and nowhere. I got out of bed and walked to the window. My house sits on the edge of a wide field. Half-dead grass, a rusted fence line, and a patch of woods farther out. That field usually gives me a clear view of the sky. But when I opened the curtains, everything looked normal. No clouds, no movement, just stars and darkness. The sound didn't stop. If anything, it deepened. I pressed my forehead to the glass, trying to judge direction. It seemed overhead but distant, like something high up but massive. The kind of sound you feel in your chest more than hear with your ears. I slid open the window a couple inches. Cold air pushed in immediately. The turbine noise got clearer but not louder. Just more defined, like multiple layers of spinning, synchronized but different pitches. It didn't make sense. I live outside a small town in western Nebraska. No military bases, no flight paths at night, no factories. The nearest airport is tiny and closes early. Nothing flies out here at that hour. I shut the window and went downstairs, partly because I wanted a better view outside, and partly because my nervous system was waking up in ways I didn't love. The floorboards creaked in that way old houses do, like the wood wasn't sure what decade it belonged to. In the kitchen, I flipped on the porch light, then immediately turned it back off. The brightness made me feel too visible. I stepped out onto the back porch anyway. The air felt thick, not humid, heavy, as if the atmosphere had weight. Breathing didn't hurt, but each inhale felt slightly resisted, like the air had more substance than usual. The turbines kept going. I looked straight up, expecting at least a shape or a movement. But the sky was perfectly clear. No blinking lights, no trails, no silhouette passing between stars, just the noise, steady and mechanical. I walked into the yard, feeling the cold through my socks. My breath fogged, but not as much as it should have. Another small wrongness I didn't understand. I stood exactly in the center of the yard, trying to pinpoint the direction of the sound. It seemed to shift when I moved, not following me, but refracting. Sometimes it felt directly above, sometimes slightly east. Like whatever caused it wasn't a single point, but a broad area. After maybe a minute, the air got heavier again. My ears popped, subtle but noticeable. I swallowed, then swallowed again, and the pressure didn't ease. I looked back toward the house to ground myself. It looked smaller in the darkness than it should have. A stranger's home, almost. The porch light switch glowed faintly inside the kitchen window like a warning indicator. Then the sound changed. It didn't fade or stop. It layered. A new tone joined the low whir, higher, faint, drifting in and out like a malfunctioning radio signal. Not static. More like a distant note played on an instrument I couldn't name. The higher tone wasn't rhythmic. It pulsed irregularly, as though responding to something unseen. I remember standing there thinking, this is wrong. Not dangerous, not definitely threatening, just wrong, like encountering something your brain was never designed to interpret. The turbine foundation of the sound began to slow. Not dramatically, but noticeably. The pitch dropped slightly, stretching thin as if whatever machinery or force was generating it was winding down. The upper tone flickered a few more times, then faded completely. The air pressure eased all at once. My ears cleared. I could suddenly hear the ordinary world again. The distant barking of a dog, the faint hum of a streetlight half a block away, the rustle of dried grass as the wind finally picked back up. And then the turbines stopped. The silence that followed felt too empty, like the sound had carved out space and left a hollow behind. I tilted my head upward again, scanning every inch of black sky. Nothing moved. No residual glow or trail, no evidence of any aircraft or weather event. The stars looked completely untouched. I stayed out there for another minute, waiting for a return of anything unusual. Nothing happened. The heaviness in the air lifted. My breath fogged normally. The cold felt like regular cold again. When I went back inside, the digital clock on the stove blinked 3:48 a.m. Power hadn't gone out. Nothing else was blinking. So I don't know why the clock did that. I pressed the button to set it again, but the minute counter skipped ahead twice before settling. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I checked online to see if any aircraft had flown over the area at that time. Nothing. Not even a weather balloon or a maintenance survey flight. The sky had been clear. No wind advisories, no seismic activity, no explanation at all. A few nights later, while sitting on the porch after work, I noticed something else. The field seemed quieter than normal. No crickets, no owls, no distant freight train hum, just the kind of quiet where your ears strain to find something. I tried telling myself I was imagining it because of what happened earlier in the week. But the silence sat there, heavy and expectant, until eventually the wind rustled through the trees and everything snapped back into place. I didn't hear the turbine sound again. Not that week, not since. But sometimes late at night when the house settles and the heater turns off, I catch myself listening for it, waiting for the sky to fill with a noise that shouldn't exist, a noise with no source, a noise heavy enough to breathe. It hasn't come back, but the air still feels different on certain nights, like something large and silent is passing high above, just out of sight. I woke up sometime around 4 in the morning with that feeling, like someone had been standing right outside my bedroom window. Not a dream, not sleep paralysis, just a sudden alertness, the kind that snaps you upright before your brain catches up. My heart was already beating hard when I opened my eyes. The house was quiet. Too quiet for spring, honestly. I live outside Mariposa, near the edge of Sierra National Forest, and even at night there are always some sounds. Owls, wind in the pines, the occasional truck on the distant highway. But when I woke up, the silence hit me first. No insects, no breeze, not even the hum of the fridge seemed normal. It felt muffled, like something dampened all the noise. I didn't get out of bed at first. I just lay there, listening, staring at the faint outline of the curtains over the window. I could see a sliver of darkness between the panels, and that was enough to make me hesitate. I didn't want to move the curtains and see. I don't know what I expected. A person? An animal? Nothing at all. I told myself it was just an overactive brain. Maybe a loud noise I didn't remember hearing. Maybe the dog next door barking had woken me up, except the neighbors didn't have a dog anymore. Their old one died in the winter. After a minute, I got up slowly and walked to the window. I didn't open the curtains. I just pressed my hand softly against the fabric and felt the slightest warmth on the inside. Not warm like sunlight, obviously, but warmer than the rest of the room. I pulled my hand away and felt the colder air around me again. That made no sense. Everything should have been the same temperature that early in the morning. I didn't open the curtains. I didn't want to. Instead, I went to the hallway and checked the front door to make sure it was locked. It was. The back door, too. Nothing looked disturbed. When I finally crawled back into bed, I stayed awake until dawn. By then, I'd half convinced myself it was nothing, just a weird half dream. But when the sun came up, I got dressed and went outside to look because I knew I wouldn't relax until I checked. The ground under the bedroom window looked wrong. Not disturbed, not like someone had dug or stepped heavily, just pressed. A shallow, wide indentation in the pine needles and dirt, maybe 3 or 4 feet across. Subtle enough that someone else might not have noticed it, but I know how the ground around my house looks. I sweep away needles every week. This indentation hadn't been there yesterday. There were no footprints, no sign of an animal, no shoe marks, just a gentle, even compression. I crouched down and touched it. The earth felt firmer, almost like something heavy had settled there briefly and then left without shifting its weight. I checked for animal tracks. Further out, nothing. I circled the house. Nothing. It was just that one spot, beneath the window where I'd woken up feeling watched. After breakfast, I tried to get my mind off it by working on the shed doors, The hinges always stick after winter storms, but I couldn't focus. Every time the wind rustled the trees, I glanced toward the house, expecting to see someone standing there. Around noon, I walked back to the indentation again. It looked the same as before. Not deeper, not disturbed, just the same wide, shallow dip. I took a picture of it, thinking maybe the camera would catch something my eyes didn't. The photo looked ordinary, just some flattened pine needles. That night, I left the porch light on, even though I don't usually. I sat in the living room with the TV on mute, listening for anything out of place. The forest sounded back to normal. Bugs, distant wind, even a coyote far off. Nothing strange. I told myself I was being ridiculous, but around midnight the house got quiet again, the same thick silence as the night before. It settled slowly, not all at once, like the world was turning the volume down a little at a time. I muted the TV completely. No crickets, no wind. Even the refrigerator hum thinned into almost nothing. I sat frozen on the couch, staring toward the hallway. I couldn't see the bedroom door from where I was, but I could picture the window perfectly. Thin curtains, that faint glow of the porch light filtering through. I forced myself to stand and walk toward the bedroom. My footsteps sounded dull, like the air absorbed the sound. When I reached the doorway, I stopped. The curtains weren't moving, but I sensed something on the other side of them. Not a shape, not a shadow, just a pressure. Like the space next to the house was occupied in a way my brain couldn't categorize. I didn't get any closer. I backed away slowly and returned to the living room, where I sat on the edge of the couch and waited. I don't know for how long, maybe 20 minutes, maybe an hour. Then, without warning, the normal night sounds came back. Crickets first, then a gust of wind, then the low hum of the house returning to itself. It didn't feel subtle, it felt like something heavy had lifted away. I didn't go outside until sunrise. When I did, the indentation under the window looked deeper. Not by much, just enough that I could tell the difference. Fresh pine needles had drifted into it during the night, but the shape was clearer now, like something wider than a person had settled there again. I didn't see footprints then either. I didn't tell Rachel or any of the neighbors. I didn't file a report. There was nothing to report except a vague sense that something I couldn't see had stood outside my window. Twice. For the next few nights, I slept in the living room with the curtains open so I could see everything. Nothing strange happened. No silence dropping over the house, no pressure in the air, no sense of being watched. After a week, things felt normal again. But the indentation under the window stayed. The wind shifted the pine needles around, but the ground itself remained pressed in a way it never had before. I finally scattered fresh soil over it, just so I wouldn't have to look at it every morning and wonder. Sometimes, I still wake up suddenly, convinced something is near the window again. Not often, but enough that I sleep lighter than I used to. And every time I step outside in the morning, I glance at that patch of ground, even though I covered it, half expecting to see the earth pressed down again, quiet and heavy, like something stood there in the night without leaving a single footprint. I heard the humming before I was fully awake. It wasn't loud, more like a deep vibration that seemed to come from the walls, or maybe from inside my own chest. I remember lying there for a few seconds trying to figure out if it was part of a dream, but the sound didn't fade the way dreams usually do. It stayed steady, low, even, like a giant electric motor running somewhere overhead. My first thought was that the HVAC unit on the roof of the building had kicked on, but I live in a single-story house in Brookdale. There's nothing on the roof except shingles and a vent pipe. No reason anything should be humming. I sat up slowly. The vibration didn't change. It pulsed faintly through my ribs, like standing next to a big subwoofer. Even breathing felt strange, like the air was thicker than usual. The clock on my nightstand said 2:27 a.m. I listened harder, waiting for another sign of what it could be. A plane? A neighbor's generator? A transformer 2 streets over? But there was no mechanical clatter, no Doppler shift, no rhythmic chug of anything natural or man-made. Just that low, chest-deep hum, steady as a heartbeat. The house felt too still. No creaking, no wind, no passing cars outside. I didn't even hear insects, which was strange for my neighborhood. It all felt muted under that vibrating sound. I got out of bed and walked toward the hallway. The vibration got stronger as I moved through the house, but especially near the living room, like the sound was more concentrated toward the front of the house. The windows weren't rattling, but they felt tense, almost like pressure was building on one side. I hesitated at the front door, hand hovering over the deadbolt. Some part of me expected something to knock back if I touched it. The hum kept going, drone-like but almost too smooth, too even. Nothing that's steady comes from anything normal. I unlocked the door and cracked it open. The hum stopped instantly. Not faded, not lowered. Stopped like someone had cut a wire. The sudden silence made my ears ring. I stood there with the door halfway open, waiting to hear it start again, but there was nothing. The air outside was cool, still, and completely quiet. I stepped onto the porch. The neighborhood looked normal. Streetlights glowing, parked cars lined up along the curb. A sprinkler ran somewhere down the block, soft, rhythmic clicking. The sky was cloudless and dark, just a scattering of stars above the rooftops. No aircraft, no drones, no flickering lights, no shadows moving across the street, and absolutely no hum. I walked down the first 2 steps and scanned the sky directly above my house. It felt almost stupid doing it, standing there barefoot in pajama bottoms at 2:30, staring upward like I was expecting something to be hovering over me. But after hearing that vibration through my ribs, I needed to check. Nothing. Just empty sky. But the air felt wrong. Not warm, not cold, just off. Thick in a way I couldn't explain, like the atmosphere had been stirred a few seconds earlier and was settling back into place. I stood there for a full minute, waiting to hear any sign of the hum returning. It didn't. Instead, the neighborhood sounds slowly came back. A car in the distance, the rustle of leaves, a dog barking 2 streets over. I finally went back inside and locked the door behind me. My chest still buzzed faintly, like the vibration had left something behind. I took a few deep breaths to shake it off, but the sensation hung on longer than the noise had. I walked from room to room just to reassure myself everything was normal. The house felt unchanged. No lights were on that shouldn't be. Nothing had fallen. The thermostat showed the same temperature as before. The only thing that stood out was the silence inside. It wasn't total, but it felt heavy, like the walls had absorbed the leftover vibration and were still settling from it. I lay back down eventually, though I kept the light on. I didn't fall asleep until nearly 4. The next morning, I checked around the house in daylight. The roof was fine, no loose shingles, no fallen branches. The vents were all intact. The attic was empty, except for insulation and old holiday decorations. Nothing that could hum or vibrate. My neighbor, Mrs. Adler, was outside watering her garden, so I asked if she'd heard anything during the night. She shook her head and said she'd slept straight through. When I mentioned a humming sound, she said, like the power lines buzzing, and pointed toward the poles, but the lines were normal. And the sound I heard wasn't like that anyway. It didn't come through the air, it came through me. Before I left for work, I opened the front door again and stood on the porch, listening. Morning traffic was picking up, birds were loud, everything seemed normal. But the air still felt a little heavy, like residue from something that had been there before. That night, I went to bed later than usual. I kept the hallway light on. I wasn't exactly expecting the hum to return, but I also wasn't ruling it out. I fell asleep eventually, and sometime around the early morning hours, maybe 3, maybe 4, I woke up suddenly. Not to a noise, not to a vibration, just the feeling that something had woken me. I listened hard, ears straining for any sound above the house, any faint droning or chest-deep hum. The room was quiet. The air was normal. My chest felt still. I waited in the dark for a long time, maybe half an hour, but the hum didn't come back. Not that night, anyway. Still, every time the house settles, every time I hear distant machinery, every time something buzzes faintly against my ribs for no reason at all, I remember standing on the porch in the middle of the night, the way everything fell silent the exact moment I stepped outside, like something that had been right above me had pulled away just fast enough not to be seen. And I wonder if it's going to return. I was standing in my backyard a little after 9, mostly just killing time while my dog Luna sniffed every patch of grass like she'd never been outside before. It had rained earlier, one of those short evening showers that leaves everything damp but doesn't cool anything off. The air smelled muddy and warm. Clouds were moving fast overhead, thin, patchy ones catching bits of moonlight in different places. Nothing felt strange at first. It was just another humid night in a small neighborhood outside Canaville. Quiet except for the usual bugs, a distant AC unit, and the occasional car passing the main road. Then my ears popped. Not both at once, just the left one first, then the right, like someone pressing lightly on the sides of my head. It wasn't painful, just sharp and sudden enough to make me stop walking. I swallowed, trying to equalize them the way you do on an airplane, but the pressure didn't settle immediately. It clung there for a few seconds, buzzing faintly behind the eardrum. I looked around without knowing why. It wasn't instinct exactly, more like the atmosphere around me had shifted in a way my body reacted to before my brain could catch up. Luna froze too, halfway through lifting her leg on the cherry tree. Her ears went rigid. The cricket stopped. Not gradually, just stopped. That's when I noticed the light. It wasn't bright. If anything, it was weaker than a star, but bigger. A little sphere of pale white drifting between the clouds, moving at a slow, steady pace. At first, I thought it was a plane caught behind the wispy layers, but there was no blink, no red or green navigation light, no sound. It made no sense how quiet it was. Normally, when it's that still out, you can hear a jet miles away. This thing was silent. Luna whimpered, low and uncertain, and stayed glued to my leg. She almost never does that. She's usually too focused on marking the entire property as hers. The light slid out from behind one cloud and into a clear patch. That's when I realized it wasn't as far away as I first assumed. The size was wrong. Too big to be a star, too defined to be a planet, too small to be anything I'd expect to see that low in the sky. It looked like it was maybe a few hundred feet up. Hard to tell, but it wasn't space high. I held my breath without meaning to. The pressure in my ears faded, but the silence didn't. The light dipped slightly, like it was adjusting its path. Not wobbling like a balloon, not curving like a drone, just a soft, deliberate change in direction. Then it moved laterally, cutting across the sky in a smooth arc that didn't match the wind direction at all. I checked the treetops. Barely any movement. The clouds above were moving west. The light drifted east. I didn't move. I felt like if I blinked, it would disappear. It drifted behind another cluster of clouds, dimming as the foggy layers passed over it. I waited for it to emerge on the other side. It didn't. I kept staring, counting seconds, trying to predict where it should have come out. 5 seconds. 10, 20. Nothing. Then the silence broke. Not with sound, but with the lack of something. The air felt thinner suddenly, like the humidity had been sucked out of it. Luna backed up until she hit the sliding door and scratched at it, whining now. I finally stepped backward too because the pressure in my ears came back again, this time gentler, like I was adjusting altitude. The sky looked normal now, just clouds moving fast, moonlight cutting through the gaps, the faint orange glow of town hanging beneath everything. But the moment felt wrong, like something had passed through and left the atmosphere settling behind it. I let Luna inside and stepped in after her, leaving the door open just a crack. Part of me wanted to shut it immediately, but the other part felt weirdly drawn to keep watching outside. I turned off the kitchen light so the reflection wouldn't block my view. The crickets hadn't come back yet. The silence in their place felt too heavy. I watched the sky for a good 2 minutes, waiting for the light to reappear. Nothing happened. The pressure in my ears faded again, slowly this time, like easing out of a deep tunnel. I told myself it could have been anything. A drone with its lights diffused through the moisture, a helicopter moving away silently, the moon reflecting weird off wind-blown mist. But none of those explanations matched the way it moved, or the way the air reacted, or the way the animals went quiet all at once. I closed the sliding door and locked it. I almost never lock it until I go to bed. As I walked through the living room, I felt something shift in the house, like a faint tremor. Just one subtle vibration through the floorboards, not enough to rattle anything, but noticeable enough that I stopped walking. It didn't repeat. Luna didn't react. That made it even stranger. I checked the time on the stove, 9:14 p.m. Then I glanced at the microwave, 9:11. My phone said 9:12. The clocks weren't far apart, but they never disagreed. Not by minutes. And they weren't wrong earlier. I'd checked the stove clock when I started making dinner around 7. Everything had matched then. I didn't try to fix them. Something about adjusting the clocks felt like admitting something unusual had happened. I went back to the sliding door one more time and peered outside. The crickets had finally started up again, but weakly, like they were testing the air first. A breeze moved through the neighborhood, shaking the branches and rustling the leftover rain off the leaves. Everything looked normal, but the silence from earlier still lingered somewhere in the back of my mind like an imprint. So did the memory of that small floating light, how it drifted with purpose, how it vanished in the middle of open sky, and how the entire environment seemed to respond to it in ways I didn't have words for. I didn't stay up waiting for it to return. I went to bed. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that faint glow moving between the clouds. Too deliberate, too silent, too aware. And every now and then, on completely ordinary nights, my ears pop the same way. And for a few seconds, the world around me holds its breath again. I woke up because something felt wrong with the room. Not a sound, exactly. More like a pressure that pushed me out of sleep. When I opened my eyes, the first thing I saw was the alarm clock on my nightstand blinking 12. The hallway clock was blinking too. So was the oven clock in the kitchen. Every digital thing in the house was flashing like the power had gone out, but I hadn't heard anything that would have woken me. It was maybe 3 or 4 in the morning. The house was warm the way it gets on summer nights when you forget to crack a window, but the air felt heavier, like the inside of a car right before a thunderstorm. I sat up and listened. Nothing. Not even the usual hum of the fridge. I walked to the front door because I thought maybe a transformer had blown somewhere down the block. That happens a lot where I live in Crescent Hill. Old lines, old houses, lots of trees leaning where they shouldn't. I didn't turn on any lights since they were all blinking anyway. I just opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The air outside was still and warm. It wasn't windy, wasn't raining, nothing unusual weather-wise, but right when I stepped forward, I heard this low humming far off in the distance. Low enough that I felt it in my chest more than I heard it. I stood still and listened harder. I tried to figure out what direction it was coming from, but it seemed to hang in the air like it wasn't tied to anything. I thought it might be a plane, but it didn't sound like one. No rising or falling pitch, just a flat tone that didn't change. It reminded me of the vibration you get when you put your hand on an old refrigerator compressor, but stretched out across the whole neighborhood. I walked down the porch steps and onto the driveway. The humming wasn't loud, but it felt close somehow. I glanced up out of instinct, expecting maybe a weird cloud or something reflecting light. The sky was clear, just a handful of thin stars showing through the city haze. Nothing moved. The hum cut out all at once. No fade, no slow drift away, just gone. The sudden quiet was strange enough that I stayed outside waiting to hear something else. A dog barked somewhere a few streets over, like it had just snapped out of whatever held it still before. A sprinkler clicked on down the block. Everything started sounding normal again. I went back inside and checked my phone. The lock screen said 3:17 a.m., but the battery icon was stuck on the charging symbol even though it wasn't plugged in. A second later, it corrected itself. I went room to room resetting clocks so they wouldn't drive me crazy later, and I noticed the microwave display flicker once when I set the time. Just once, like it was recalibrating. I should have gone back to bed. But something felt unfinished. I couldn't shake the sense that I'd woken up in the middle of something instead of after it. I got a glass of water and stood by the back door, looking out the small window. My yard was dark, but the houses behind mine had their porch lights on, and I could see the usual shadows the fences made. Then I noticed that one of the shadows didn't look right. It wasn't shaped like anything in the yard. It wasn't tall or detailed, more of a smear, like something had blocked the light for a moment and then moved. I blinked a few times and stared at the same spot. The fence line looked normal again. The odd shape was gone. I pressed my hand to the glass and realized it felt cooler than the air inside. Not cold, just a little too cool for a summer night. Like the temperature inside the house had shifted without me noticing. I went back to the living room, sat down on the couch, and listened for the hum again. Nothing. No weird vibrations, no lights flickering, even the fridge started up again with its usual rattle. I finally tried to sleep around 5. I didn't really get much rest. My head kept replaying the hum, trying to match it to something familiar. A generator, a truck idling, an HVAC unit. But none of those fit. The sound had felt too even, too wide. If that makes sense. The next afternoon, after work, I asked my neighbor Dan if his power had gone out during the night. He said no, everything was normal at his place. I asked if he'd heard anything strange. He said, "Like what?" And I almost made something up, but then I just shrugged and said it was nothing. Back inside, I checked the breaker panel, thinking maybe something inside the house had tripped. Everything was on. I went through the clocks again. They were all fine. Nothing flickered. Nothing reset. I tried to write it off, but little things kept sticking out to me for the rest of the week. My phone glitched twice, opened the settings menu on its own, froze for a second during a call. My porch light flickered when I came home one night, only once, and didn't do it again. Stuff that could easily be explained, but the timing bothered me. 2 nights after the humming, I woke up again, not from any noise, but from the same pressure feeling as before. That heaviness in the air. I checked the clocks immediately. They were fine. Nothing was blinking. But when I stepped onto the porch, the night was completely still again. No wind, no insects, not even traffic from the highway a mile away. The quiet was thick enough that I froze halfway down the steps. I didn't hear the hum this time, but the silence had weight to it, like it was waiting for something. I stayed out there for a minute, maybe 2. Then the sprinkler down the block clicked on again, the same way it had the first night, like the world was resuming from a pause. I went back inside and stood in the hallway where I could see the bedroom clock. Completely normal. Steady. Nothing wrong. But that feeling, the sense of something hovering just outside of what I could pick up, stayed with me. Not a presence, not anything supernatural, just the idea that something had been moving through the area and I happened to wake up at the wrong moment. I still don't know what the hum was. It hasn't come back in the same way since, but every now and then, usually in the early morning, I swear I feel the house go quiet for a second too long, like the air is waiting for something to pass by again. I was sitting on the porch that night, mostly just to cool off. It was one of those late August evenings where the air didn't move at all, and the humidity felt like it wrapped around you no matter what you did. I'd turned off the TV because the house felt stuffy, and I took a folding chair outside with a glass of water, figuring 10 minutes in the open would feel better than another hour indoors. My place sits on the edge of a small town in eastern Kentucky, with a row of trees behind the yard that leads into a long stretch of woods. On summer nights, you can barely hear yourself think over the cicadas. That's why it stood out when the sounds cut off. I didn't notice it at first. I was scrolling through something on my phone, half reading, half daydreaming. Then I put the phone down, and the silence hit me in a way I couldn't ignore. It wasn't gradual. It didn't taper off. 1 second, the chirping and buzzing were there, and the next second they weren't. No wind, no rustling, no distant dogs, nothing. Just dead still. It made me sit up straight. You don't get silence like that out there unless something big moves through. A person, a bear, sometimes a stray dog. I leaned forward in the chair, listening for footsteps or twigs breaking. The air felt thicker somehow, like it was holding its breath with me. I glanced toward the tree line, expecting to see movement. The trees were dark silhouettes, nothing more. No shifting shadows, no pairs of eyes catching the porch light. Then the blue glow appeared. At first I thought it was a car turning onto one of the back roads near the woods, headlights bouncing through the trees. Except the color wasn't right. It was a pale blue, almost like moonlight reflected off water, except there wasn't any water out there. It was also too steady, no flickering, no pattern like headlights flashing between trunks. It drifted higher, clearing the tops of the trees. Perfectly smooth, no sound at all. I leaned forward so slowly I barely felt myself move. The glow wasn't bright enough to light up the yard, but it was enough to make the leaves under it look washed out, like a dim lantern hung way too high. It moved from left to right, not fast, not slow, just steady, like it was following a path. I tried to think of a drone, Maybe some neighbor messing around with one of those high-end models. But it didn't behave like a drone. No wobble, no small course corrections, no noise. Absolutely none. The night was so still I would have heard even a cheap one. My phone was still on the armrest of the chair. I reached for it without taking my eyes off the glow. The second my hand touched the phone, the blue light paused. Not faded. Paused, like it froze in place. I let go of the phone immediately. The glow drifted again, same pace as before, like nothing had happened. I tried again, slower, just sliding my fingers toward the phone. This time the glow dimmed slightly, like something inside it contracted and then brightened again to the same level. It didn't stop moving, but the change was obvious enough that I jerked my hand back without even thinking. I didn't touch the phone after that. The glow reached the middle of the tree line and started rising. Not sharply, just enough that it shifted from hovering above the trees to floating higher into the sky. I stood without realizing I'd done it. My chair creaked behind me. The glow kept rising, still silent, still smooth, still impossibly steady. When it was maybe 2 or 3 times the height of the trees, it dimmed again. This time it stayed dim, shrinking into itself, almost like a paper lantern being closed. The edges blurred until it was just a hazy patch of light. Then that patch stretched upward, thinning into a shape I couldn't make sense of, like a smear on glass. It vanished a second later, not drifted away. Vanished. The silence stayed. I stood there waiting for the cicadas to start again. I don't know how long it took. Maybe 10 seconds, maybe a full minute. But when they came back suddenly, the exact same way they'd stopped. A full wall of sound switching back on. It actually made me jump. I sat back down slowly, keeping my eyes on the sky. Nothing else moved. No glow, no odd shapes, just the normal summer night. I finally picked up my phone, half expecting the battery to be dead or the screen to glitch. It was fine. Everything looked normal. I stayed outside another half hour, hoping maybe I'd imagined it and something would prove me wrong. Nothing did. The next night I tried sitting on the porch again, thinking maybe whatever I'd seen had some explanation I hadn't considered. The insect noise stayed normal. No silence, no glow. But every so often, I caught myself staring at that same line of trees, waiting for the night to cut out again like someone hitting a switch. I never saw the glow again, but I still checked without thinking, half expecting the air to go still, and that pale blue shape to drift into view like it had somewhere to be, passing above me without even noticing I was there. I noticed the light before I noticed anything else. It was late, close to 11, and I was taking my usual loop around my neighborhood in Bloomington to get some air before bed. The sky was overcast, that dull orange-gray you get from the streetlights reflecting off clouds. Nothing about the night felt strange at first, just warm, quiet, a little humid. I was halfway down Larkspur Drive when I saw it, a dim white light hanging above a rooftop maybe 4 houses ahead of me on the right. At first, I thought it was someone's security light, or maybe a drone somebody was messing around with, but it didn't move at all. It just hovered there, maybe 20 feet above the shingles. Too low for a plane, too steady for anything handheld. I stopped walking without thinking. The houses around me were dark, except for a couple of porch lights. The one with the light above it was completely dark. No TV glow, no inside lamps, nothing. The street itself was dead quiet. No cars, no dogs, just that soft hum you get from the intersection a block over. The light didn't flicker. It didn't sway. It just held its place like it was pinned to the air. I kept staring at it, trying to make sense of the distance. It wasn't bright enough to be a helicopter's spotlight or anything like that. It didn't cast any noticeable beam down onto the roof. It was more like a dull, solid orb, the size of a softball maybe, glowing but contained. Almost like it didn't light up the air around it, only itself. I walked a little farther, slowly, because something in me didn't want to get closer too fast. I couldn't hear anything from it. No buzzing, no motor, no sound at all. If it had been a drone, I would have heard the rotors from that distance, especially at night. But the air was still. When I moved closer, the light didn't respond. It didn't shift or blink or get brighter. It was unnerving how steady it was. The houses on that street sit pretty close to one another, maybe 20 feet between them. The light hovered right over the ridge of the roof, exactly centered, like whatever it was had chosen the spot deliberately. When I reached the house across the street from it, I stopped again. I felt hesitant, I guess, but not scared yet. More confused than anything. I glanced around to see if anyone else was outside. No movement in windows, no cars passing, nothing. The whole street felt paused. The light finally changed right as I opened my mouth to call out, though I don't know who I thought I'd be calling to. It didn't flicker or fade, it just started rising. Smooth and perfectly vertical. No acceleration, just moving, like it had been attached to an invisible string being pulled upward. I followed it with my eyes as it climbed above the roofline, then above the big maple tree in the yard next door, then above the streetlights. It didn't blink or wobble, it didn't get brighter or dimmer. It stayed the same muted white glow as it went up. It disappeared so abruptly I didn't register the moment it vanished. 1 second it was there, halfway up the cloud cover. The next, the spot was blank, like it had never been lit at all. No streak, no fade out, just gone. I kept standing there like an idiot, waiting for it to come back, but the sky looked normal again. Just that washed out nighttime orange. Something about how suddenly it vanished made my chest tighten. I started walking again, even though my legs felt shaky, like they were filled with buzzing soda water. By the time I was at the end of the block, I heard a noise behind me. Something small, like a click or a snap. It came from one of the yards across the street. I stopped. The noise didn't repeat. There was no movement, no light, nothing. But I got the weirdest urge to hurry home, like the quiet itself had turned into a warning. I walked faster. As I was turning onto my street, I noticed something else. The cicadas had stopped. They'd been loud that whole week, but now the air was dead silent. Even the distant traffic noise from the main road seemed lower, like someone had turned the city down a notch. For a moment, I wondered if there'd been some kind of power issue. The house where the light had hovered had no visible lights on, but so did plenty of other houses. People just went to bed early around here. The street lights were still on, though. Everything looked normal. But then my phone buzzed. I pulled it out, thinking maybe I had a text, but it wasn't a notification. The screen had turned white. Just a flat white rectangle. No icons, no time, nothing. I tapped it a few times and it didn't respond. I pressed the side button and the screen stayed lit. The device vibrated again, a short tremor like a heartbeat. I didn't stop walking. I didn't even slow down. I shoved the phone into my pocket and headed straight for my house. The silence felt thicker the closer I got, like the whole block was wrapped in insulation. When I reached my driveway, I had this moment where I didn't want to look up. I can't explain why. I just felt like something would be there if I checked, above the house, above the tree in the yard, above me. Not another light. Just something occupying space it shouldn't. But I did look up, and there was nothing. Just clouds. Inside, the house felt too warm, like someone had closed every vent. I turned on the kitchen light and stood there waiting for something else to glitch or blink or hum. Nothing did. The fridge kicked on, the AC finally rattled awake. The normal house sounds came back gradually, like someone releasing their hand from my ears. My phone rebooted on its own about 5 minutes later. When it came back on, the clock was wrong. Not by hours, just by a few minutes. I checked the camera roll to see if something had triggered the white screen. No new photos, no corrupted files. Everything normal. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept replaying the way the light rose. So smooth, so straight, like it didn't care about gravity at all. Nothing I've ever seen moves like that. Not balloons, not aircraft, not drones. It didn't even seem to push against the air. Over the next few days, I tried to walk the same route at the same time, hoping maybe I'd see something that would make the whole thing feel more explainable. Like a reflection or someone's weird backyard gadget or something. But the house where it hovered stayed dark every night and nothing unusual showed up. A week later, I finally saw the family who lived there, an older couple named the Merricks, watering their flower beds. I didn't ask them anything. I thought about it, but what would I say? Hey, did you notice a floating light above your roof the other night? They'd think I was messing with them. It hasn't happened again. I still walk some nights, but I catch myself glancing at the rooftops more often than I used to. And every once in a while, When the neighborhood gets too quiet too suddenly, I feel that same pressure in my chest, like something is hovering just out of sight, waiting for the clouds to thin.